Hey guys, tonight we venture into the frozen fjords and ice-covered longhouses of the Viking world, where surviving winter wasn't just about staying warm, it was about staying alive in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. From ingenious heating methods that would make modern engineers jealous to communal survival strategies that bound entire communities together, the Vikings didn't just endure the brutal Nordic winters, they thrived in them. So before we begin this journey into the frozen north, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what the weather's like for you right now. It's always fascinating to see our global community. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's settle in for tonight's exploration together. When you think of Vikings, you probably picture fierce warriors sailing across stormy seas, raiding monasteries, and charging into battle with axes raised high. But for every month spent plundering distant shores, Vikings faced at least 6 months trapped by winter's icy grip in their homeland. Imagine living where temperatures plunged far below freezing for half the year, where the sun barely rose above the horizon for months, and where a single miscalculation about food, fuel, or shelter could mean death for your entire family. Yet the Vikings didn't just survive these conditions, they built a civilization that dominated the medieval world. Tonight, we'll uncover how these legendary seafarers transformed brutal winters from a death sentence into a season of preparation, community, and remarkable ingenuity. The survival strategies they developed weren't just about staying warm. They were about creating a way of life that could flourish in the frozen heart of Scandinavia. If you think your studio apartment feels cramped when your roommate brings home their entire friend group, spare a thought for the Vikings, who solved the housing crisis by simply building one enormous room and cramming everyone they'd ever met inside it. The Viking longhouse wasn't just a home, it was a carefully engineered fortress against winter, a community centre, a barn, a workshop, and occasionally a small-scale diplomatic crisis, all rolled into one spectacularly smoky, crowded, and surprisingly effective survival machine. When the first snow began to fall across the fjords of Scandinavia, these massive wooden structures became arcs of civilization, designed to keep entire extended families, their livestock, their servants, their guests, and their accumulated grudges alive until spring decided to show up again. Picture this. You're standing before a building that stretches nearly 200 feet in length, longer than half a football field, but only about 20 feet wide. It's like someone took a modern ranch house and stretched it out until it resembled a wooden aircraft hangar with delusions of grandeur. The walls rise from massive stone foundations, built from thick oak timbers that could withstand not just the howling winds of a Nordic winter, but also the occasional axe-wielding neighbour with poor impulse control. This wasn't a house, it was a statement, a declaration that said, "Winter, we see your blizzards, your months of darkness, your temperatures that could freeze a warrior's breath mid-battle cry, and we raise you one enormous wooden middle finger." The longhouse was the ultimate expression of Viking pragmatism, a culture that looked at the world's harshest climate and decided the best response was to build something so thoroughly over-engineered that it could probably survive until Ragnarok. And in many ways, they succeeded. These structures were built to last not just one winter, but generations of winters, housing family lines that would stretch back to the days when Thor was still answering prayers and forward to when their great-grandchildren would be telling exaggerated stories about their ancestors' legendary tolerance for discomfort. The engineering that went into these behemoths was nothing short of remarkable, especially considering that the Vikings accomplished it all without benefit of architectural degrees, computer modelling, or even a reliable supply of hot coffee to fuel their late-night planning sessions. They built from experience, from trial and error, and from the hard-earned knowledge that in a climate where winter lasted longer than most Hollywood marriages, you got exactly one chance to build something that worked. Get it wrong, and you didn't get to complain to the Better Business Bureau. You got to freeze to death while contemplating your construction choices. The foundation of every longhouse began with massive stones, carefully selected and positioned to create a stable base that could support the enormous weight of the structure above, while also providing crucial insulation from the frozen ground below. Vikings understood something that modern apartment dwellers often forget. Cold rises from the earth just as readily as it falls from the sky, and no amount of wool socks will save you if you are essentially camping on a glacier. These stone foundations were works of art in their own right, fitted together with the precision of master craftsmen who knew that a wobbly foundation meant a wobbly house. And a wobbly house in a Norwegian winter was just a very expensive way to commit suicide. Above this stone base rose walls constructed from massive oak timbers, each one carefully selected, seasoned, and fitted with the patience of people who understood that rushing the job meant spending the winter explaining to their frozen relatives why they decided to cut corners on insulation. The Vikings didn't just stack logs like some overeager Boy Scout building his first campfire. They employed sophisticated joinery techniques that created walls, thick enough to stop a charging boar and tight enough to keep out the kind of wind that could strip bark from trees and dignity from warriors. The logs were hewn flat on the inner and outer surfaces, creating walls that could be chinked with moss, clay, and other insulating materials without leaving gaps wide enough for Arctic breezes to stage sneak attacks. Between the massive timbers, Vikings packed every conceivable material that might slow down heat loss: dried grass, moss, sheep's wool, and in desperate times, whatever organic matter they could find that wasn't currently being used for more pressing survival needs. It was early medieval weather stripping, applied with the thoroughness of people who knew that every small gap in the wall was an invitation for winter to come inside and make itself comfortable. The roof structure was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the entire design. A masterpiece of engineering that had to shed snow, resist wind, and somehow manage not to collapse under the weight of an entire winter's worth of accumulated precipitation. Vikings built steep pitched roofs using massive timbers that rose to a central ridge beam, a wooden spine that ran the entire length of the building, like the backbone of some enormous, dormant dragon. The rafters that supported this structure were hewn from trees carefully selected for their strength and grain, and they were fitted together with joints that could flex with the building's movement without failing catastrophically. Over this wooden framework, Vikings laid layer upon layer of materials, designed to create what modern builders would recognize as a remarkably sophisticated thermal barrier. First came a layer of birch bark, waterproof and flexible, followed by thick layers of turf cut from the surrounding landscape. This wasn't just sod thrown haphazardly onto the roof. It was carefully selected turf with root systems intact, creating a living roof that would continue to grow and strengthen over time. The grass and wildflowers that sprouted from these roofs in summer were more than decoration. They were part of an integrated system that provided insulation, drainage, and even a bit of emergency animal feed if times got desperate enough. If you think modern green roofing is some innovative new concept, Vikings were perfecting the technique while your ancestors were still trying to figure out why their caves kept flooding every spring. The turf roof was a closed-loop system that worked with the natural environment rather than fighting against it. In winter, the thick layer of earth and vegetation provided insulation that could keep the interior relatively warm, even when the outside temperature dropped to levels that would make a polar bear reconsider its life choices. In summer, the same roof helped keep the interior cool and provided a pleasant green space where children could play, and adults could pretend they weren't living in what was essentially a very sophisticated barn. But the real genius of the longhouse design revealed itself when you stepped through the massive oak doors and into the interior. What greeted you wasn't the cozy, compartmentalized living space that modern sensibilities might expect, but rather one enormous room that stretched from one end of the building to the other, a cavern of wood and smoke that could easily accommodate 50 or more people without anyone technically being forced to sleep, standing up. It was open-plan living taken to its logical extreme, the kind of space that would make modern minimalists weep with joy and modern families flee in terror. The entire length of the longhouse was organized around a central corridor that ran from the main entrance to the far end of the building, with the various living and working areas arranged on either side like the ribs of some massive wooden skeleton. This central aisle wasn't just a walkway, it was the spine of the entire social and practical organization of the household, the main artery through which flowed the daily life of everyone who called the longhouse home. Along this central corridor, at carefully spaced intervals, stood the hearths, the beating hearts of the entire structure, and the difference between a warm winter and a very short, very cold winter. These weren't the quaint, decorative fireplaces that modern homeowners use to create ambience while their central heating does the actual work. Viking hearths were serious business, massive stone-lined fire pits that stretched across a significant portion of the longhouse's width and were designed to burn continuously from the first frost of autumn until the last thaw of spring. They were fed with enormous logs that had been carefully selected, cut, split, seasoned, and stored with the dedication that modern survivalists usually reserve for hoarding canned goods and ammunition. The central hearth system was a masterpiece of medieval engineering that would make modern HVAC technicians nod in professional respect. The fires were positioned to create overlapping zones of warmth that, in theory, provided adequate heating for the entire length of the building. In practice, this meant that the people sleeping closest to the hearths enjoyed tropical luxury by Viking standards, while those at the far ends of the building had to content themselves with merely not freezing solid during the night. It was radiant heating with all the efficiency of a system designed by people who measured success not in precise temperature control, but in the number of household members who were still breathing come morning. The smoke from these massive fires presented both a challenge and an opportunity that Vikings approached with typical Norse pragmatism. Rather than installing elaborate chimney systems that would have required advanced masonry skills and materials they couldn't always obtain, longhouses were designed to allow smoke to rise naturally and escape through vents in the roof. This created an interior atmosphere that was, to put it diplomatically, an acquired taste. The air was thick enough that newcomers might find themselves wondering if they'd accidentally wandered into a very crowded barbecue pit. But the smoke served multiple purposes beyond the obvious. One of making everyone smell like they'd been sleeping in a campfire. The smoky atmosphere helped preserve food that was stored in the rafters, creating a natural curing environment that could keep meat and fish edible for months. It also provided a degree of pest control that any medieval household would appreciate, since most insects and small vermin found the environment less than hospitable. The smoke even served as a form of primitive air conditioning, since the hot gases rising to the roof created air circulation that helped distribute heat more evenly throughout the building and drew fresh air in through carefully placed vents and gaps. Living in this smoky environment required a certain adjustment of expectations that modern people, accustomed to climate-controlled spaces and air purifiers, might find challenging. Vikings developed what can only be described as industrial-strength lungs and a cultural tolerance for atmospheric conditions that would trigger every smoke alarm in a modern building. Children grew up in this environment, learning to navigate by sound and smell as much as sight, developing a kind of sensory adaptation that served them well in a world where clear air was a luxury and survival was a daily negotiation with hostile forces. The social organization of the longhouse reflected and reinforced the hierarchical structure of Viking society in ways that were both practical and symbolic. The high-status end of the building, typically the far end from the main entrance, was reserved for the Jarl or head of household and his immediate family. This area was marked by more elaborate furnishings, finer textiles, and proximity to the best hearth, the one that was most carefully tended, and least likely to smoke out its occupants during the crucial sleeping hours. It was the medieval equivalent of first-class seating, complete with better food, warmer sleeping areas, and the privilege of complaining about the service without fear of being thrown out into the snow. Moving down the social ladder meant moving toward the entrance end of the building, where the air was cooler, the smoke thicker, and the accommodations decidedly more Spartan. Servants, farmhands, and visiting relatives of dubious social standing found themselves assigned sleeping spaces that were progressively closer to the door, and thus closer to the drafts, the noise, and the general inconvenience of being the first people that visitors encountered when they stumbled in from the cold. It was a seating arrangement that made everyone's place in the social hierarchy immediately and inescapably clear, enforced not by formal rules, but by the simple physics of heat distribution and smoke circulation. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of longhouse living was the Vikings' matter-of-fact acceptance of sharing their space with livestock. This wasn't some quaint rural custom or a temporary emergency measure. It was a carefully planned survival strategy that recognized that in a climate where winter could kill animals as easily as people, Keeping your most valuable creatures alive was just as important as keeping your family breathing. The lower end of the longhouse, typically the area closest to the main entrance, was specifically designed to accommodate cattle, horses, pigs, and sheep that were too valuable to risk leaving outside in the killing cold. If you think your apartment feels crowded when your neighbor's music is too loud, imagine sharing 200 feet of living space with not just your extended family, but also with a dozen sheep, several pigs, a handful of chickens, and at least one horse that doesn't particularly care about your personal space or your need for uninterrupted sleep. The Vikings approached this challenge with the same practical resignation they brought to most of life's inconveniences. You deal with it because the alternative, frozen livestock and economic ruin, was considerably worse than the alternative of waking up to the sound of a cow relieving itself 15 feet from your sleeping furs. The livestock area was separated from the human living space by low walls, or wooden barriers that provided some degree of separation, while still allowing the animal's body heat to contribute to the overall warming of the building. It was symbiotic relationship that benefited everyone involved. The animals stayed alive through the winter. The humans gained additional heat sources, and everyone got to enjoy the rich, complex, aromatic bouquet that comes from sharing close quarters with creatures that have very different standards of personal hygiene. The daily routine of feeding, watering, and caring for these indoor animals added another layer of complexity to longhouse life that would challenge even the most patient modern pet owner. Hay and grain had to be stored in sufficient quantities to feed the animals through months of winter. Water had to be provided without creating muddy, unsanitary conditions in the living space. And waste had to be managed in ways that maintained some semblance of habitability. Vikings developed elaborate systems for mucking out animal areas, storing feed, and managing the constant challenges of keeping large mammals healthy and content in what was essentially a very large, very smoky basement apartment. The women of the household bore much of the responsibility for managing this complex domestic ecosystem, coordinating the care of animals, the preparation of food, the maintenance of textiles, and the general organization of a living space that had to serve as home, barn, workshop, and social center all at once. They developed skills that would make modern multitaskers weep with admiration, spinning wool while watching children, while keeping an eye on livestock, while preparing meals over an open fire, while managing the complex interpersonal dynamics of several dozen people who couldn't escape each other's company for months at a time. The sleeping arrangements in a longhouse were a masterclass in medieval logistics that would challenge the organizational skills of a modern military quartermaster. Beds, such as they were, consisted of wooden platforms built along the walls, raised slightly above the floor to provide some insulation from the cold and damp that seeped up from below. These platforms were covered with layers of straw, hay, wool, and animal hides, whatever organic materials could be gathered to create some barrier between sleeping bodies and the unforgiving hardness of wood planks. Privacy was a concept that had to be reimagined in a space where 50 people might be sleeping within earshot of each other. Families claimed sections of the sleeping platforms, and hanging curtains or screens made from woolcloth provided the illusion of private space while doing nothing to muffle sounds, smells, or the general awareness that you were sharing your most vulnerable hours with more people than most modern individuals encounter in a typical week. It was communal living taken to an extreme that would make modern commune members flee back to their nuclear families and private bedrooms. The hierarchy of sleeping arrangements reflected the same social stratification that governed every other aspect of longhouse life. The most prestigious sleeping spots were closest to the best hearths, furthest from the door, and elevated on the highest platforms. These choice locations were claimed by the household's leadership and their immediate families, while everyone else arranged themselves in descending order of importance toward the colder, draftier, more inconvenient areas of the building. It was a nightly reminder of social status that couldn't be ignored or forgotten, even in sleep. Managing the complex logistics of feeding this indoor population required storage systems that would impress modern preppers. The longhouse had to accommodate not just enough food for the human inhabitants, but also feed for the animals, fuel for the fires, and all the tools, weapons, textiles, and equipment needed to sustain a complex household through months of isolation. Walls were lined with shelves, hooks, and storage areas that maximized the use of every available cubic foot of space. Dried fish hung from the rafters. Barrels of preserved foods lined the walls, and sacks of grain were stacked in carefully organized piles that had to be accessible while also being protected from moisture, pests, and the occasional curious pig. The rafters above the hearths became smoking areas where meat and fish were slowly cured in the rising heat and smoke, creating preserved foods that could last through the winter while also filling the longhouse with the rich, complex aromas of foods in various stages of preservation. It was a system that turned the entire building into a giant food storage and processing facility, where every breath of air carried hints of the smoking salmon, drying herbs, and fermenting dairy products that represented the difference between surviving the winter and starving during the spring. Water management presented another challenge that Vikings solved with typical ingenuity and a tolerance for inconvenience that would break the spirit of modern suburbanites. Wells were often located outside the longhouse, meaning that water had to be carried in and stored in quantities sufficient for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and providing for the animals. In winter, this often meant melting snow and ice, a process that required constant attention to the fires and careful rationing of fuel resources. Large wooden barrels and ceramic vessels stored water inside the longhouse, but these had to be positioned carefully to prevent freezing, while also remaining accessible for daily use. The waste management systems of a longhouse were exactly as sophisticated as you might expect from a culture that prioritized survival over sanitation. Human waste was typically handled through outdoor facilities that remained functional even in winter, through careful design and regular maintenance, though the daily trek to these facilities in sub-zero temperatures provided its own form of natural motivation for efficiency. Animal waste from the indoor livestock was collected and stored for use as fertilizer in the spring, creating value from what would otherwise be merely an unpleasant byproduct of the survival strategy. The social dynamics of longhouse living created relationships and conflicts that were magnified by the impossible-to-escape proximity of winter isolation. Friendships were tested, romances flourished and withered, and family disputes had to be resolved without the option of storming off to a different location. The Vikings developed elaborate social codes and customs designed to manage the inevitable conflicts that arose when large groups of strong-willed people were forced to share space, resources, and breathing room for months at a time. Storytelling became more than entertainment. It was a crucial social valve that allowed tensions to be expressed indirectly, cultural values to be reinforced, and community bonds to be strengthened through shared narratives. The long winter nights were filled with tales of heroic adventures, legendary battles, and mythological adventures that served as both escapism and education. Skalds, the Viking poets and storytellers, earned their place in the Longhouse hierarchy not just through artistic skill, but through their ability to maintain morale, resolve conflicts, and provide the psychological sustenance that was just as important as physical food for surviving the psychological challenges of winter isolation. Music and games provided additional outlets for entertainment and social bonding that helped prevent the cabin fever that could turn a survivable winter into a psychological nightmare. Board games like Tafel provided intellectual challenges and competitive outlets that could absorb attention for hours, while musical instruments created soundscapes that could transform the smoky, crowded longhouse into something approaching festive. Dice games, riddle competitions, and various forms of storytelling contests created structured social interactions that channeled competitive energies into relatively harmless directions. The economic life of the Longhouse continued even during the winter months, with various crafts and trades practiced in the warm interior spaces. Metalworking, when possible, was carried out near the hearths, where the existing fires could be used to heat metal and provide light for detailed work. Textile production was a constant activity, with spinning, weaving, and sewing occupying much of the winter time for the women of the household. Leatherworking, wood carving, and various forms of equipment maintenance and repair filled the long dark hours, while also producing goods that would be needed for the coming year. The spiritual life of the Longhouse community was deeply intertwined with the daily routines of survival and social interaction. The hearth fires were more than just heat sources. They were sacred spaces where offerings were made to the gods who controlled the weather, the harvest, and the family's fortune. Religious observances and seasonal celebrations provided structure and meaning to the long winter months, creating shared experiences that reinforce community bonds and cultural identity. The Longhouse represented more than just an architectural solution to the challenges of Viking winter survival. It was a complete social system that integrated family life, economic activity, religious practice, and community governance into a single remarkably efficient package. The very design of the building enforced social hierarchies, encouraged cooperation, and created the kind of intensive community experience that could either forge unbreakable bonds or drive people to homicidal fury. Sometimes both in the same winter. When spring finally arrived and the doors of the Longhouse could be thrown open to welcome fresh air and sunlight, the community that emerged was inevitably changed by their shared experience of survival. Some relationships had been strengthened by the crucible of forced proximity, while others had been strained to the breaking point. The skills, stories, and social bonds forged during the long dark months would shape the community's identity and relationships for the rest of the year, creating a cycle of separation and reunion that defined the rhythm of Viking life. The Longhouse stands as perhaps the most perfect expression of Viking pragmatism, a structure that solved multiple complex problems with a single, elegant solution that required no advanced technology, exotic materials, or specialized expertise beyond what was available to any reasonably competent medieval community. It was architecture as social engineering, building design as survival strategy, and housing as cultural expression all rolled into one enormous, smoky, crowded, and remarkably effective whole. In a world where winter was a 6-month siege against civilization itself, the Longhouse was the Vikings' fortress, their ark, and their answer to the fundamental question of how human beings can not just survive, but thrive in conditions that would challenge the endurance of polar bears and the patience of saints. If you think keeping your gas fireplace running through winter is a challenge, imagine being personally responsible for maintaining an open flame for 6 straight months, while knowing that letting it die meant your entire family would probably join it in extinction. For Vikings, fire wasn't just a cozy ambience feature or a backup heating source when the furnace acted up. It was the thin orange line between civilization and becoming a very well-dressed popsicle. The hearth fire was the beating heart of Viking survival, a hungry, demanding, temperamental beast that required constant feeding, endless attention, and the kind of round-the-clock devotion usually reserved for newborn babies or particularly needy houseplants. Except this houseplant could save your life or kill you with equal efficiency, depending on how well you treated it. The Vikings developed what can only be described as a fire-based civilization, a culture so thoroughly dependent on controlled combustion that their entire social structure, religious beliefs, and daily routines revolved around the sacred act of keeping flames alive. They were essentially medieval fire farmers, cultivating heat and light with the same dedication that other cultures brought to growing crops or raising livestock. And like any form of agriculture, it required specialized knowledge, careful planning, back-breaking labor, and a healthy respect for the forces you were trying to control. The first challenge in this elaborate dance with combustion was obtaining enough fuel to keep fires burning through winters that could stretch from October to April, roughly the same amount of time it takes most people to forget their New Year's resolutions and remember them again. Vikings couldn't simply order a cord of seasoned hardwood from a local supplier and have it delivered by a truck with a hydraulic lift. They had to gather, cut, split, transport, and store enough wood to keep multiple fires burning continuously for months, all while managing every other aspect of survival in a climate that viewed human ambition with deep skepticism. Wood gathering was a year-round obsession that began the moment the snow melted and didn't end until the first serious frost made further collection impossible. Vikings understood that dry, seasoned wood burned hotter, cleaner, and longer than green wood. But proper seasoning required time that the short Scandinavian summers didn't always provide. They developed elaborate systems for selecting, cutting, and storing wood that would have impressed modern forestry experts. If modern forestry experts had to accomplish their work using nothing but axes, human muscle power, and an unwavering commitment to not freezing to death. The ideal firewood came from hardwood trees like oak, beech, and ash, species that provided dense, long-burning fuel that could sustain a fire through the long winter nights. But hardwoods were often scarce in the northern regions, where many Viking communities made their homes, forcing them to make do with whatever the landscape provided. Pine and other softwoods burned faster and produced more smoke, but they were usually more abundant and easier to cut. Birch bark was prized not just for its excellent burning qualities, but also for its waterproof properties that made it invaluable for starting fires and preserving tinder. The process of gathering wood was a community effort that involved virtually everyone capable of wielding an axe or carrying a load. Men wielded the heavy axes that could fell large trees, while women and children collected fallen branches, stripped bark, and gathered the smaller materials that were essential for fire starting and maintenance. The work was dangerous, axes were sharp, trees were heavy, and the margin for error was approximately zero, when your mistake could cost fingers, limbs, or lives. Felling a large tree with hand tools required skills that modern chainsaw operators might find quaint, but would probably struggle to replicate. Vikings had to understand wood grain, tree structure, and the physics of controlled falling to bring down massive oaks and pines without crushing themselves, their tools, or valuable structures nearby. They developed techniques for directional felling that could place a tree exactly where they wanted it, using nothing but careful axe work, wedges, and an intimate understanding of how wood behaves under stress. Once trees were down, the real work began. Massive trunks had to be sectioned into manageable lengths, then split into pieces small enough to fit into hearths, while still large enough to burn for reasonable periods. Vikings became masters of reading wood grain, finding the natural splitting lines that could turn a daunting log into neat, stackable firewood with minimum effort. They understood that splitting wood along the grain was infinitely easier than trying to cut across it, and they developed a variety of wedges, mauls, and techniques for coaxing even the most stubborn pieces into compliance. The splitting process required not just strength, but also strategy. Different types of wood responded to different approaches. Some split cleanly with a single well-placed blow, while others required careful work with wedges and patience to gradually open splitting lines. Knotty or twisted wood might resist all attempts at conventional splitting, requiring creative solutions like burning or soaking to make the job possible. Vikings became wood whisperers, able to read the personality of each piece and apply exactly the right amount of force in precisely the right place to achieve the desired result. Transport was another logistical challenge that tested both human endurance and engineering creativity. Moving several tons of firewood from the cutting site to the storage areas near the longhouse required careful planning and considerable physical effort. Vikings used sleds, rollers, and human carrying power to move wood across landscapes that might be muddy, rocky, snow-covered, or all three simultaneously. They learned to work with the terrain rather than against it, using downhill slopes, frozen rivers, and other natural features to make the job easier. Storage was perhaps the most critical aspect of the entire wood gathering operation, since improperly stored fuel could rot, mold, or absorb moisture that would make it difficult or impossible to burn when needed. Vikings built elaborate woodsheds and storage areas that protected their precious fuel from rain, snow, and humidity, while still allowing air circulation that would continue the seasoning process. They understood that wood needed to breathe to stay dry, but also needed protection from direct exposure to weather that could undo months of careful preparation. The storage structures themselves were masterpieces of practical engineering designed to maximize capacity while minimizing the space and materials required. Wood was stacked in careful patterns that promoted air circulation, shed water, and remained stable even when stacked to impressive heights. Vikings learned to build their wood piles like walls, with interlocking patterns that distributed weight evenly and resisted collapse, even when partially depleted during the winter months. Different types of wood were stored separately, with the best burning material reserved for the most critical uses and lower-grade fuel allocated for less demanding applications. Dry, seasoned hardwood might be saved for the coldest nights and most important occasions, while green wood and softwoods were used for everyday heating and cooking. It was fuel management that required the same careful rationing and planning that governed food storage and consumption. The amount of wood required to sustain a Viking household through winter was staggering by modern standards. A single longhouse might consume 20 to 30 cords of wood during the cold months, enough timber to build several modern houses. Gathering this much fuel required months of dedicated labor by multiple people, representing one of the largest investments of time and energy in the Viking survival strategy. It was a commitment that had to be made every year, regardless of other demands or competing priorities. Beyond the massive quantities needed for heating, Vikings also had to gather specialized materials for fire starting and maintenance. Tinder had to be collected, prepared, and stored in waterproof containers that would keep it dry and accessible even in the worst weather. The best tinder came from birch bark, dry grass, and fungus that grew on certain trees, but it required careful preparation to ensure it would catch fire reliably when needed. Vikings became experts at recognizing and harvesting the materials that would serve them well when a fire needed to be started quickly or rekindled from dying embers. Kindling small, easily ignited material that could bridge the gap between tinder and larger fuel had to be gathered and stored in massive quantities. Thin twigs, split wood, and dry branches were collected throughout the warmer months and stored in dry locations where they would remain accessible even when snow buried most of the landscape. The quality and availability of kindling often determined how easily fires could be started and maintained, making it nearly as important as the main fuel supply. The actual process of maintaining fire through the long winter months required skills that went far beyond simply throwing wood onto flames. Vikings had to understand combustion in ways that would impress modern fire scientists, developing intuitive knowledge about airflow, fuel ratios, and heat management that allowed them to coax maximum warmth from minimum fuel. They learned to read fires like experienced mechanics read engines, recognizing the subtle signs that indicated whether a fire was burning efficiently or wasting precious resources. Firebuilding was an art form that began with the careful selection and arrangement of materials. The foundation of any good fire started with properly arranged tinder that would catch easily and burn hot enough to ignite kindling. Over this went progressively larger pieces of wood, arranged to promote airflow while providing enough fuel to sustain the growing flames. Vikings understood that fire needed air to breathe, but too much air could cause flames to burn too fast and waste fuel, while too little air could smother the fire entirely. The arrangement of logs in the hearth followed principles that balanced heat output, burn time, and efficiency. Large logs were positioned to create combustion chambers that concentrated heat while allowing adequate airflow, creating fires that could burn steadily for hours with minimal attention. Vikings learned to build fires that would burn down to useful coals for cooking, while still providing adequate heat for warmth, maximizing the utility of every piece of precious fuel. Managing the airflow around fires required constant attention and adjustment. Vikings used crude but effective bellows made from animal hides to provide controlled air supply when fires needed encouragement, and they learned to manipulate the placement of logs and the positioning of barriers to control how much air reached the flames. Too much air and the fire would consume fuel wastefully. Too little and it would die down to useless smouldering that provided little heat and filled the longhouse with choking smoke. The skill of banking fires for overnight burning was perhaps the most critical fire management technique Vikings had to master. Banking involved arranging coals and partially burned logs in configurations that would burn slowly through the night, providing continuous heat without requiring constant attention. It was a delicate balance that required understanding how different woods burned, how coals behaved under various conditions, and how to arrange materials for maximum longevity without creating fire hazards. Banking was typically done by covering glowing coals with ash, which slowed combustion while preserving the heat needed to rekindle flames in the morning. The ash acted as insulation, keeping coals hot enough to ignite new fuel while preventing them from burning away completely during the night. Vikings learned to judge exactly how much ash to use, how to arrange the coals for optimal preservation, and how to position fresh fuel so it would catch fire easily when the banking was disturbed in the morning. The morning routine of rekindling banked fires was a daily ritual that could determine the success or failure of the entire day. Vikings developed techniques for quickly and reliably bringing banked coals back to full flames, using carefully prepared tinder and kindling to bridge the gap between glowing embers and roaring fire. The person responsible for morning fire duty, often one of the women of the household, had to work quickly to restore heat before the longhouse became uncomfortably cold, making fire starting skills essential for domestic success. Fuel efficiency was a constant concern that influenced every aspect of Viking fire management. They learned to burn different types of wood at different times to maximize heat output, while conserving the best fuel for when it was most needed. Dense hardwoods were saved for the coldest nights and longest burns, while softer woods were used for quick heating and cooking fires. Green wood, while less desirable, could be used when properly mixed with seasoned fuel, extending supplies when necessary. The Vikings also developed techniques for extracting maximum heat from smoke and combustion gases before they escaped the longhouse. Rather than building fires that sent heat straight up and out through roof vents, they learned to create fires that burned in ways that kept heat circulating in the living space longer. This involved understanding how hot gases moved through the longhouse interior and positioning fires to take advantage of natural air circulation patterns. The role of smoke in Viking fire management extended far beyond the inevitable byproduct of burning wood. Smoke was a tool, a resource, and a vital component of the household's survival strategy. Vikings learned to control and direct smoke for specific purposes, turning what modern people might consider a nuisance into an asset that served multiple essential functions throughout the winter months. Food preservation was perhaps the most important secondary use of hearth smoke, transforming fresh meat and fish into preserved foods that could last through the winter and beyond. The Vikings developed sophisticated smoking techniques that used the controlled heat and chemical properties of wood smoke to cure foods in ways that prevented spoilage while enhancing flavor. Different types of wood produce smoke with different preservative qualities. Juniper smoke was prized for fish, while oak smoke was preferred for meats. The smoking process required careful control of temperature and smoke density to achieve proper preservation without overcooking or ruining the food. Vikings learned to manage fires specifically for smoking, creating low, smouldering burns that produce maximum smoke with minimum heat. They built smoking chambers and areas within the longhouse where food could be exposed to smoke for extended periods while remaining accessible for monitoring and adjustment. Fish, in particular, benefited from careful smoking that could transform perishable catches into preserved foods that would remain edible for months. Salmon, herring, and other fish were cleaned, salted, and hung in the smoky areas of the longhouse, where they slowly dried and absorbed preservative chemicals from the wood smoke. The process required constant attention to ensure proper curing without spoilage, making smoke management an essential skill for household food security. Meat smoking followed similar principles, but required different techniques to accommodate the size and structure of larger animals. Strips of beef, pork, and game were prepared and hung in smoking areas where they gradually transformed from fresh meat into jerky-like preserved foods. The smoking process had to be carefully controlled to ensure complete preservation while maintaining palatability, requiring skills that took years to master. The Vikings also used smoke for pest control, recognizing that the dense, chemical-laden atmosphere of the longhouse helped control insects, rodents, and other unwanted creatures that might otherwise infest stored food and living areas. The constant presence of smoke made the longhouse environment hostile to many pests, while being tolerable to humans who had adapted to the conditions from childhood. Medicinal uses of smoke were another aspect of Viking fire management that demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of combustion chemistry. Different woods produce smoke with different therapeutic properties, and Vikings learned to burn specific materials when treating respiratory ailments, infections, and other health problems. Juniper smoke was believed to have antiseptic properties, while birch smoke was used for treating skin conditions and respiratory problems. The spiritual and ceremonial aspects of Viking fire management elevated hearth fires from mere survival tools to sacred elements central to religious and cultural life. The hearth fire was more than a heat source. It was a connection to the gods, a symbol of the family's prosperity and spiritual health, and a focal point for rituals that bound the community together. The maintenance of sacred fires required not just technical skill, but also spiritual preparation and cultural knowledge that was passed down through generations. Fire rituals began with the lighting of the hearth at the start of winter, ceremonies that invoked the protection of the gods and blessed the fires that would sustain the household through the dark months. These rituals often involved special kindling, blessed tinder, and ceremonial procedures that transformed the practical act of fire starting into a spiritual observance. The first fire of winter was typically lit by the head of the household, marking the beginning of the season, when the family would depend entirely on their preparations and the favour of the gods. Throughout the winter, the hearth fire served as the centre for daily and seasonal rituals that maintained the spiritual health of the household. Offerings were made to the fire, prayers were spoken over the flames, and important family decisions were made in the warm glow of the hearth. The fire was believed to carry prayers and offerings to the gods, making it a vital link between the earthly struggles of winter survival and the divine forces that controlled weather, fortune, and fate. The gods themselves were closely associated with fire in Viking mythology, with deities like Loki embodying both the creative and destructive aspects of flames. The hearthfire was sacred to Frigg, the goddess of the household, and maintaining it properly was seen as essential for keeping her favour and protection. Letting the fire die through carelessness or neglect was not just a practical disaster, but also a spiritual failure that could bring misfortune to the entire household. Seasonal fire festivals marked important points in the Viking calendar, celebrations that reinforced community bonds while honouring the forces that controlled their survival. The winter solstice fires were particularly important, marking the longest night and the beginning of the sun's return. These festivals involved special fires, communal feasting, and rituals designed to ensure that light and warmth would return to the world after the darkest period of winter. The social aspects of fire management created hierarchies and responsibilities that reflected and reinforced the broader structure of Viking society. Fire tending was skilled work that required knowledge, experience, and reliability, making it a source of status and influence within the household. The person responsible for maintaining the hearth fire held a position of considerable responsibility, since the survival of everyone in the longhouse depended on their skill and dedication. Women typically bore primary responsibility for daily fire maintenance, a role that gave them significant influence over household operations, despite the patriarchal structure of Viking society. The woman who could keep fires burning efficiently, manage fuel consumption wisely, and coordinate the various uses of fire and smoke held power that extended far beyond the immediate area around the hearth. Her skills could mean the difference between a household that thrived through winter and one that merely survived. Children learned fire management skills from early childhood, starting with simple tasks like gathering kindling and progressing to more complex responsibilities as they demonstrated competence and reliability. Fire tending was one of the essential life skills that marked the transition from childhood to adult responsibility, and young people who mastered these skills early gained respect and increased responsibilities within the household. The consequences of fire management failures were immediate and potentially catastrophic, creating pressure that modern people, accustomed to backup heating systems and emergency services, might find difficult to imagine. When fires died completely, the household faced not just discomfort, but genuine danger, especially during the coldest periods of winter. Rekindling dead fires required techniques and materials that weren't always available, and the time required to restart heating could allow indoor temperatures to drop to dangerous levels. Fire starting from scratch during winter required tools and techniques that Vikings had to master as completely as modern people learn to drive cars or operate computers. Fire steel, flint, tinder, and kindling had to be maintained in perfect condition and readily accessible at all times. The process of creating fire from these basic materials could take considerable time and effort, making prevention of fire loss far preferable to dealing with the consequences of starting over. The Vikings developed elaborate backup systems and contingency plans for fire emergencies, recognizing that the failure of their primary heating system could quickly become a survival crisis. Multiple fires were maintained when possible, reducing the risk that a single accident could leave the household without heat. Special fire-starting materials were stored in multiple locations, and backup supplies of the finest tinder and kindling were kept in reserve for emergencies. Community cooperation became essential when fire disasters struck individual households, since a family that lost their fire during severe winter weather might not be able to restart it before suffering serious harm. Neighbours were expected to share fire, provide materials for restarting dead hearths, and offer temporary shelter if necessary. The social obligations surrounding fire sharing created bonds that reinforced community solidarity and ensured that fire disasters didn't become community catastrophes. The psychological aspects of living with constant fire management responsibility created stress and anxiety that affected everyone in the Viking household. The knowledge that carelessness, bad luck, or simple accident could result in disaster made fire tending a source of constant worry that modern people, accustomed to reliable heating systems, might find difficult to understand. The responsibility of keeping everyone alive through fire management was a burden that shaped personalities, relationships, and decision-making throughout the winter months. Yet Vikings also found comfort and security in their mastery of fire, developing confidence in their ability to control the forces that determined their survival. The warm glow of a well-tended hearth fire represented more than just physical comfort. It was a symbol of human mastery over hostile nature, a sign that skill, preparation, and dedication could triumph over the most challenging conditions. The fire was proof that humans could create their own warmth, light, and security, even in the darkest and coldest places on Earth. The daily rhythms of life revolved around the needs of the fire, creating routines and patterns that structured time and activity in ways that connected Vikings intimately with the natural cycles of combustion. Morning began with rekindling fires. Afternoon involved maintaining and feeding flames. Evening required banking for overnight burning. And night brought the constant awareness that warm sleep depended on properly prepared fires. It was a relationship with technology that was immediate, personal, and absolutely critical for survival. Fire also served as the social centre of longhouse life, the gathering place where families came together for meals, conversation, and communal activities. The warm area around the hearth was where children played. Adults worked on crafts and repairs, and community members gathered to share news, stories, and entertainment. The fire provided not just physical warmth, but also the social heat that bound communities together through the isolating months of winter. The sounds and smells of fire became the sensory background of Viking winter life, creating an environment that was distinctly different from the sterile, controlled atmosphere of modern homes. The crack and pop of burning wood, the hiss of moisture escaping from green logs, the rich smell of wood smoke mixed with cooking food and human habitation. All of these combined to create a living environment that engaged all the senses and connected inhabitants directly to the process of their own survival. As spring approached and the desperate fuel conservation of winter gave way to the relative abundance of warmer weather, the fires that had sustained Viking households through the dark months gradually diminished in importance, but never in respect. The transition from winter fire dependence to spring renewal was marked by ceremonies that honoured the fires that had preserved life and looked forward to the coming season when fuel gathering would begin again. It was a cycle that connected Vikings to the eternal rhythms of season, survival, and the sacred flames that made civilization possible in the far reaches of the northern world. The Viking mastery of fire represents one of humanity's most sophisticated relationships with controlled combustion, a partnership between human intelligence and natural forces that sustained complex communities in conditions that might otherwise have been uninhabitable. Their techniques, knowledge, and cultural practices around fire management demonstrate how survival technologies can become art forms, spiritual practices, and social institutions that define entire civilizations. In the end, Vikings didn't just survive winter. They created a fire-based culture that turned the management of flames into a way of life, a system of beliefs and a set of skills that sustain their communities for centuries in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. If you think meal prep is challenging when you're trying to eat healthy for a week, imagine planning the menu for 50 people for 6 months without benefit of refrigeration, grocery stores, or the luxury of popping out for takeout when your calculations go horribly wrong. For Vikings, winter wasn't just a season when fresh food became scarce. It was an annual siege that required the kind of logistical planning that would make modern military quartermasters weep with respect. And grocery store managers flee to careers in accounting. Every grain of barley, every strip of dried fish, every wheel of fermented cheese represented the difference between greeting spring as a survivor or becoming an interesting archaeological find for scholars to puzzle over centuries later. The Viking approach to winter food security was part science, part art, and part desperate gamble with the forces of decay and spoilage that seemed determined to turn carefully hoarded provisions into inedible disappointments just when they were needed most. They couldn't simply stock up on canned goods, frozen dinners, and emergency rations. Instead, they had to transform the bounty of summer and autumn into foods that would remain edible through months of storage in conditions that modern food safety inspectors would condemn without a second thought. It was food preservation on an epic scale, requiring skills that combined the precision of a laboratory scientist with the intuition of someone who understood that getting it wrong meant watching your family starve while surrounded by spoiled food. The scale of the challenge was staggering by any standard. A single longhouse community might need to preserve enough food to sustain 50 to 100 people for 6 months, plus feed the livestock that shared their living space and provide emergency reserves for unexpected guests, extended bad weather, or the inevitable miscalculations that came with predicting exactly how much a community would consume during the long, dark months. It was like trying to stock a medium-sized restaurant for half a year, while knowing that if you ran out of ingredients, you couldn't simply order more from your suppliers. The foundation of Viking food preservation began with understanding the enemies they faced: bacteria, mold, insects, rodents, and the simple passage of time that turned fresh, nourishing food into rotting garbage that could kill as efficiently as starvation. Vikings became masters of the ancient arts of preservation, developing techniques that controlled moisture, temperature, air exposure, and chemical composition to create foods that could last months or even years, while remaining not just edible, but genuinely nutritious. Salt was the most precious weapon in the Viking arsenal of preservation, worth its weight in silver and sometimes literally traded pound for pound with precious metals. But salt wasn't just sprinkled on food, like a modern seasoning. It was applied with the methodical precision of battlefield medics treating wounds, because that's essentially what Vikings were doing, treating fresh food to prevent the fatal infections of decay that would otherwise claim their winter stores. They learned to pack meat and fish in salt so thoroughly that every fiber was penetrated, creating environments where the bacteria responsible for spoilage simply couldn't survive. The salting process began with the careful selection of the best specimens. Fish had to be fresh enough that they still smelled like the sea, rather than like something that had died under unfortunate circumstances. And meat had to be processed immediately after slaughter, while it was still in prime condition. Timing was everything in Viking food preservation. Hesitate too long, and the race against decay was already lost before preservation could begin. Fish salting was perhaps the most critical preservation skill Vikings had to master. Since fish represented both the most abundant protein source and the most challenging preservation problem. Fresh fish spoiled faster than almost any other food, but properly salted fish could remain edible for months or even years. The process required stripping fish down to their essential components, removing organs and parts that would spoil quickly, while retaining the maximum amount of edible flesh. The art of fish gutting and cleaning reached levels of efficiency that would impress modern seafood processing professionals. Vikings could reduce a large salmon to perfectly cleaned fillets in minutes, working with knives sharp enough to shave with, and techniques honed by generations of people who understood that wasting edible food was a luxury they couldn't afford. Every scrap of usable flesh was preserved, and even the bones, scales, and organs were often processed into secondary food products or materials for other purposes. Large fish were typically cut into strips that could be salted evenly and dried efficiently, while smaller fish might be preserved whole or in large pieces depending on their size and the intended storage method. The cutting process required understanding fish anatomy well enough to separate meat from bone without waste, while creating pieces that would cure properly without developing pockets of moisture that could harbor decay. The actual salting required enormous quantities of salt applied with techniques that ensured complete penetration without wasting this precious preservative. Fish pieces were often packed in wooden boxes or barrels with alternating layers of salt and flesh, creating environments where every surface was in contact with preservative. The salt drew moisture from the fish while creating chemical conditions that prevented bacterial growth, essentially mummifying the flesh in ways that preserved both nutrition and flavor. Smoking represented another crucial preservation technique that Vikings elevated to an art form requiring patience, skill, and an almost supernatural ability to judge when fish or meat had reached the perfect state of preservation without being turned into inedible leather. The smoking process combined controlled heat, chemical preservation from wood smoke, and moisture removal to create foods that could last months, while developing complex flavors that made preserved foods genuinely enjoyable rather than merely tolerable. The construction of smoking facilities required engineering skills that balanced airflow, heat control, and smoke production to create environments where food could be cured properly. Vikings built elaborate smoking houses and chambers that could accommodate large quantities of fish and meat while allowing careful control of temperature and smoke density. These structures had to be designed to maintain consistent conditions over days or weeks of continuous operation while remaining accessible for monitoring and adjustment. Different types of wood produce smoke with different preservative qualities and flavors, making wood selection as important as any other aspect of the smoking process. Juniper was prized for its strong antiseptic properties and distinctive flavor, while birch provided mild smoke that was ideal for delicate fish. Oak produced steady, long-burning smoke that was perfect for larger pieces of meat that required extended smoking periods. The smoking process itself required constant attention and adjustment to maintain optimal conditions throughout the curing period. Too much heat and the food would cook rather than cure, creating products that spoiled quickly and wasted precious resources. Too little heat and the food wouldn't dry properly, leaving moisture that could support decay. The ideal smoking process created steady, low heat with dense smoke that penetrated food completely, while gradually removing moisture over days or weeks. Monitoring smoking food required skills that combined the senses with technical knowledge about the preservation process. Experienced smokers could judge the progress of curing by smell, touch, and visual inspection, recognizing the subtle signs that indicated when food was properly preserved. The surface texture, color changes, and even the sound food made when handled provided clues about the internal moisture content and preservation state. Different foods required different smoking techniques and time frames, making the process a complex orchestration of multiple preservation projects that had to be coordinated to make efficient use of smoking facilities and fuel. Fish might require only days of smoking, while large pieces of meat could need weeks of careful curing to achieve proper preservation. The timing had to be planned to ensure that smoking facilities weren't overwhelmed during peak preservation periods, while also ensuring that foods were ready when needed. Fermentation represented perhaps the most mysterious and challenging preservation technique Vikings employed, a process that relied on controlled decay to create foods that would resist uncontrolled decay. It was preservation through paradox, allowing certain types of bacteria and microorganisms to transform foods in ways that made them hostile to the organisms that caused spoilage. Vikings became masters of managing microscopic life, forms they couldn't see or understand in scientific terms, but whose behavior they learned to predict and control through generations of careful observation. Dairy fermentation was particularly important in Viking food preservation, transforming milk that would spoil in days into cheeses and fermented products that could last months. The process began with careful selection of milk from healthy animals at the right time in their lactation cycle, since the quality of the starting material determined the success of the final product. Milk had to be fresh enough to ferment properly, but handled carefully to avoid contamination that could ruin the entire batch. The fermentation process required controlling temperature, moisture, and contamination to encourage the growth of beneficial bacteria while preventing harmful organisms from taking hold. Vikings learned to create environments where lactic acid bacteria could thrive, producing acids that preserved the dairy products while developing complex flavors that made fermented foods genuinely appealing. They used wooden containers, animal skin bags, and ceramic vessels to create fermentation chambers with the right conditions for different types of preserved dairy. Cheesemaking represented the most sophisticated form of Viking dairy fermentation, a process that transformed liquid milk into solid foods that could last through entire winters. The process began with careful heating and acidification of milk to separate curds from whey, followed by pressing, salting, and aging that created dense, durable foods with concentrated nutrition. Vikings learned to make both soft cheeses that would be consumed relatively quickly and hard cheeses that could age for months while improving in flavor and preservation quality. The aging process for hard cheeses required storage environments that maintained consistent temperature and humidity while protecting the cheese from pests and contamination. Vikings built special storage areas in their longhouses where cheeses could age properly, often in cool areas near the walls where temperature fluctuations were minimized. The cheeses were regularly turned, cleaned, and monitored to ensure proper aging without spoilage. Fermented fish represented another important preservation technique that created foods with extended shelf life and concentrated nutrition. Fish could be fermented in brine solutions or buried in controlled conditions, where beneficial bacteria transformed the flesh into products that resisted spoilage while developing strong, distinctive flavors. The process required careful management of salt concentration, temperature, and timing to achieve proper fermentation without allowing harmful bacteria to dominate. Grain storage presented its own unique challenges that required techniques designed to protect valuable carbohydrates from moisture, pests, and spoilage over many months of storage. Grains were the foundation of Viking winter nutrition, providing calories and basic nutrition that supplemented preserved proteins and dairy products. But grains were also vulnerable to a wide range of threats that could destroy entire winter stores if not properly managed. The harvest and preparation of grains for storage began with careful timing to ensure that crops were gathered at peak nutritional content, while avoiding weather that could damage quality. Grains had to be properly dried to remove moisture that could support mold growth, but not over-dried to the point where they lost nutritional value or became difficult to process. The drying process required balancing natural air, drying with artificial heat to achieve optimal moisture content for long-term storage. Threshing and cleaning grains required removing chaff, damaged kernels, and foreign material that could harbor pests or contribute to spoilage during storage. Vikings developed techniques for separating grain from unwanted material using winnowing, sieving, and careful sorting that removed everything except the highest quality kernels. This process was labor-intensive, but essential for creating grain stores that would remain viable through months of storage. Storage containers for grains had to protect contents from moisture, air, and pests, while remaining accessible for use throughout the winter. Vikings used wooden bins, ceramic containers, and leather bags to store grains, often sealing containers with materials that prevented air exchange, while protecting contents from environmental contamination. The storage areas themselves had to maintain consistent temperature and humidity, while keeping stored grains away from areas where cooking, moisture, or other household activities could affect storage conditions. Pest control for stored grains required techniques that prevented insects, rodents, and other creatures from accessing and contaminating food stores. Vikings learned to use aromatic herbs and other natural deterrents that made storage areas unappealing to pests without contaminating the stored food. They also built storage containers and areas that were physically secure against intrusion by larger pests like rats and mice. The rotation and monitoring of grain stores required systems that ensured older grains were used before newer ones, while maintaining awareness of the condition of stored food throughout the winter. Vikings developed methods for accessing stored grains without compromising the preservation of remaining stores, using storage systems that allowed for gradual consumption without exposing entire stores to air and moisture. Hunting and gathering strategies for winter food preparation required understanding animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and preservation requirements to maximize the food value obtained from available resources. Vikings couldn't simply hunt whenever they felt like fresh meat. They had to coordinate hunting activities with preservation capabilities and storage limitations to ensure that animal protein contributed effectively to winter food security. Large game hunting was typically concentrated in late fall when animals were at their fattest and weather conditions allowed for extended hunting expeditions. Deer, elk, and other large animals provided substantial amounts of meat that could be preserved through smoking, salting, and drying, but they had to be processed quickly and efficiently to prevent spoilage. The timing of large hunts was critical. Too early, and the meat might spoil before cold weather aided preservation. Too late, and weather conditions might prevent successful hunting. The processing of large game required skills and equipment that could transform entire animals into preserved foods within hours of the kill. Vikings had to be able to butcher large animals efficiently, separating meat from bone, while identifying cuts that were best suited for different preservation methods. Some cuts were ideal for immediate consumption, others for smoking, and still others for salting or drying. The process required coordinating multiple preservation activities simultaneously to handle the large quantities of meat that came from successful large game hunting. Small game hunting continued throughout the winter when conditions allowed, providing fresh meat that supplemented preserved foods and added variety to the winter diet. Rabbits, birds, and other small animals could be caught using traps, snares, and other techniques that didn't require the elaborate expeditions needed for large game hunting. These hunting activities required understanding animal behavior in winter conditions and developing techniques that remained effective even when snow and cold made traditional hunting methods impractical. Fishing strategies for winter food preparation had to account for both immediate consumption and preservation needs. balancing the effort required for fishing against the food value obtained and the resources needed for preservation. Vikings developed techniques for mass fishing during seasonal runs, when large quantities of fish could be caught in short periods, allowing for efficient use of preservation resources and labour. The timing of fishing activities was coordinated with preservation capabilities to ensure that large catches could be processed before spoilage occurred. Vikings learned to predict fish runs and prepare preservation facilities in advance, allowing them to take maximum advantage of brief periods when fishing was most productive. They developed nets, traps, and other equipment that could handle large volumes of fish efficiently. Gathering wild foods provided important supplements to stored and preserved foods throughout the winter, requiring knowledge of which plants remained available and nutritious during cold months. Vikings learned to identify and harvest winter-available foods like nuts, berries, and roots that could provide vitamins and minerals that were often lacking in preserved foods. These gathering activities required understanding seasonal availability and storage techniques that preserved wild foods for later use. The social and cultural aspects of winter food management created community bonds that were essential for survival, while also establishing hierarchies and relationships that reflected broader Viking social structures. Food sharing wasn't just charity, it was a complex system of obligations, status displays, and community insurance that ensured survival while reinforcing social relationships. Communal food preparation activities brought communities together for major preservation projects that required more labor than individual families could provide. Large-scale smoking operations, fish processing, and grain preparation were often community efforts that allowed sharing of specialized knowledge while creating social bonds that would be important throughout the winter months. These communal work sessions were opportunities for teaching preservation skills to younger community members while reinforcing relationships between families. The great feasts that marked the beginning and end of winter represented more than just celebrations. They were strategic food management activities that strengthened community bonds while managing food resources efficiently. Early winter feasts allowed communities to consume perishable foods that couldn't be preserved effectively while demonstrating abundance and prosperity. Late winter feasts helped reduce food stores before they began to spoil while celebrating the approach of spring and the end of scarcity. Food sharing obligations created networks of mutual support that functioned as insurance against individual family food shortages. Families who had been successful in food preservation were expected to share with those who had experienced failures, but this sharing was governed by complex social rules that balanced charity with self-preservation. The sharing relationships created during times of abundance established obligations that could be called upon during times of need. Status and hierarchy were expressed through food quality and distribution, with the best preserved foods reserved for the most important members of the community, while lower status individuals made do with less desirable preserved products. The distribution of food during communal meals reflected social relationships, while also ensuring that everyone received adequate nutrition to survive the winter. These food hierarchies reinforce social order while preventing complete inequality that might lead to community breakdown. The psychological aspects of feast and famine cycles created stress and anxiety that affected entire communities throughout the winter months. The constant awareness of limited food supplies and the inability to obtain more, if supplies ran short, created psychological pressure that influenced decision-making, social relationships, and community morale. Vikings developed cultural practices and mental strategies that helped communities cope with the psychological challenges of scarcity. The careful rationing of special foods created anticipation and celebration opportunities that helped maintain morale during the darkest months of winter. Special preserved foods might be reserved for religious festivals, important visitors, or community celebrations that broke the monotony of subsistence eating. These special foods served psychological needs that were just as important as their nutritional value. The rituals and ceremonies surrounding food preparation and consumption helped create meaning and community connection around the basic necessities of survival. Food preparation was often accompanied by singing, storytelling, and other cultural activities that transformed necessary work into social and spiritual experiences. The blessing of food stores, the ceremonies marking the beginning of preservation activities, and the festivals celebrating successful food preparation all helped create cultural meaning around survival necessities. The end of winter food anxiety that occurred when stores began to run low created community stress that had to be managed carefully to prevent panic and social breakdown. Vikings developed strategies for managing scarce food resources during the final weeks of winter while maintaining community cohesion and hope for spring renewal. These strategies included careful rationing, expanded foraging activities, and psychological support systems that help communities survive the most challenging periods. The transition from winter scarcity to spring abundance represented more than just relief from hunger. It was a community rebirth that celebrated survival while beginning preparation for the next winter cycle. The first fresh foods of spring were often celebrated with special ceremonies that marked the end of preservation dependence and the beginning of a new cycle of food gathering and preparation. The Vikings' mastery of winter food preservation represents one of humanity's most sophisticated responses to the challenge of surviving in environments where fresh food was unavailable for months at a time. Their techniques combined scientific understanding with cultural practices that created sustainable systems for feeding large communities through extended periods of scarcity. The social and psychological strategies they developed around food management were just as important as their technical preservation skills, creating communities that could not just survive, but maintain their cultural identity and social cohesion through the most challenging conditions. The legacy of Viking food preservation extends far beyond their historical period, influencing food cultures throughout Northern Europe and establishing principles of community food security that remain relevant today. Their understanding that food preservation was not just a technical challenge, but also a social and cultural necessity, created approaches to scarcity that balanced individual survival with community welfare, creating sustainable strategies that supported complex societies in harsh environments. In the end, Viking winter food strategies represented more than just survival techniques. They were expressions of human ingenuity, community cooperation, and cultural resilience that transformed the challenge of feeding people through winter scarcity into opportunities for social bonding, cultural expression, and technological innovation. They proved that with sufficient knowledge, preparation, and community cooperation. Even the harshest environmental challenges could be met not just with survival, but with dignity, culture, and hope for renewal. If you think choosing an outfit for a winter day is complicated when you're trying to balance warmth, style, and the possibility that you might need to take off your coat indoors, imagine selecting your wardrobe, knowing that getting it wrong could result in death by frostbite before lunch. Vikings didn't have the luxury of checking weather apps, popping back inside for an extra layer, or ducking into heated buildings when the cold became unbearable. Their clothing wasn't just fashion. It was a sophisticated survival system that had to function as portable shelter, status symbol, and life support equipment, all rolled into one carefully orchestrated ensemble. That could mean the difference between returning home victorious and becoming a cautionary tale about inadequate winter preparation. The Viking approach to winter dressing was less about looking good and more about staying alive long enough to worry about appearances later. Though, as we'll discover, they managed to accomplish both with a style that would make modern outdoor gear manufacturers weep with envy, and fashion designers reconsider their entire approach to functional clothing. Every thread, every layer, every carefully chosen material represented generations of accumulated wisdom about surviving in conditions that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and turn inadequately dressed warriors into very stylish corpses. The foundation of Viking winter survival began with understanding that clothes weren't just covering. They were architecture for the human body, creating microclimates and insulation systems that had to function in temperatures that would make polar bears consider relocating to more temperate climates. Vikings developed layering systems that would impress modern mountaineers, combining different materials and garments in precise sequences that trapped warm air, shed moisture, and maintained flexibility while providing protection against wind, snow, and the kind of cold that could make your breath freeze before it left your mouth. The innermost layer of Viking winter clothing was perhaps the most crucial and least glamorous component of their survival system: the humble woolen undergarment that served as the foundation for everything else. If you think modern thermal underwear is sophisticated, Vikings were perfecting the art of base layers, while most of the world was still trying to figure out how to make fire consistently. These weren't the scratchy, uncomfortable woolen garments that modern people might imagine, but carefully crafted pieces made from the finest, softest wool that could be produced by Viking textile craftswomen who understood that comfort and survival often depended on the same factors. The wool used for undergarments came from specific breeds of sheep that had been selected over generations for producing fleece with the ideal combination of warmth, softness, and durability. Vikings understood that not all wool was created equal. The coarse outer wool of a sheep might be perfect for tough outer garments, but the soft undercoat provided the fine crimped fibers that created the best insulation when worn against the skin. The selection and preparation of wool for undergarments required expertise that combined animal husbandry with textile engineering, knowledge that was typically held by the women of the community, who controlled every aspect of wool production from sheep to finished garment. The spinning of wool into thread for undergarments required techniques that produced yarn with specific characteristics for thermal efficiency and comfort. The thread had to be spun fine enough to create smooth, non-irritating fabric, while remaining strong enough to withstand the stress of daily wear and frequent washing. Viking women became masters of controlling thread weight, twist, and texture to create yarns that served different functions in the layering system, with the finest threads reserved for garments that would be worn against the skin. The weaving of woolen undergarments followed patterns that maximized warmth while allowing for the flexibility needed for daily activities. The fabric had to be dense enough to trap air for insulation while remaining breathable enough to prevent moisture buildup that could turn warm, dry clothing into damp, cold clothing that would accelerate rather than prevent heat loss. Viking weavers developed techniques for creating fabrics with different characteristics in different areas of the same garment, using tighter weaves for areas that needed maximum warmth and looser weaves for areas that required more flexibility or breathability. The construction of woolen undergarments required tailoring skills that balanced fit with function, creating garments that were close-fitting enough to trap warm air effectively, while loose enough to allow for comfortable movement and additional layers. The seams had to be strong enough to withstand daily stress, while smooth enough not to create pressure points or chafing that could become serious problems during extended periods of wear. Viking seamstresses developed construction techniques that created garments which were essentially wearable architecture, engineered for maximum thermal efficiency and durability. The next layer in the Viking clothing system typically consisted of linen garments that served multiple functions in the complex thermal management system that kept Vikings alive in subarctic conditions. Linen might seem like an odd choice for cold weather clothing, but Vikings understood textile science in ways that would impress modern fabric engineers. Linen possessed unique properties that made it ideal for moisture management. It could absorb substantial amounts of moisture without feeling wet, and it dried quickly when conditions allowed, preventing the buildup of dampness that could turn warm clothing into refrigeration systems. The cultivation and processing of flax for linen production required agricultural and technical skills that made linen one of the more labor-intensive components of the Viking textile system. Flax had to be grown, harvested, retted, broken, combed and spun through processes that could take months and required specialized knowledge passed down through generations of linen producers. The quality of linen could vary dramatically depending on the skill of the processors and the conditions during production, making good linen a valuable commodity that reflected both economic status and technical expertise. The weaving of linen for undergarments required different techniques than wool weaving, producing fabrics with characteristics that complemented wool in the layering system. Linen could be woven to different weights and textures depending on its intended use, with fine, smooth linens used for garments worn closest to the skin, and heavier, more durable linens used for outer layers that needed to withstand more abuse. The combination of linen and wool in Viking layering systems created thermal management that was more effective than either material alone. The outer layers of Viking winter clothing were where practicality met status, functionality merged with fashion, and survival clothing transformed into statements about wealth, skill, and social position. The outer tunic or dress was typically made from wool that was heavier and more durable than the wool used for undergarments, often woven with patterns, colours, and decorative elements that displayed the wearer's status while providing essential protection against the elements. The construction of outer tunics required balancing multiple competing demands. The garments had to be warm enough to provide meaningful protection, durable enough to withstand daily wear in harsh conditions, flexible enough to allow for work and combat, and impressive enough to properly represent the wearer's social position. Viking tailors became masters of creating garments that accomplished all these goals simultaneously, using construction techniques that maximized functionality while incorporating decorative elements that displayed wealth and taste. The colors used in Viking outer garments weren't just aesthetic choices. They were statements about economic resources and technical sophistication that could be read by anyone familiar with the complexity and cost of medieval dyeing. Red dyes were particularly expensive and difficult to produce, making red clothing a clear signal of wealth and high status. Blue dyes required different but equally expensive materials and techniques, while browns and greys might indicate more modest means or simply practical choices about concealment and maintenance. The patterns woven or embroidered into Viking outer garments served multiple functions beyond mere decoration. Complex patterns demonstrated the skill of the textile workers who created them, the wealth of the people who could afford such labor-intensive clothing, and often carried cultural or religious significance that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. The investment of time and skill required to create elaborately decorated clothing made such garments valuable assets that were carefully maintained and often passed down through generations. The cloaks that formed the outermost layer of Viking winter clothing were perhaps the most versatile and essential components of their survival system, serving as portable shelters that could provide protection against wind, rain, snow, and cold, while remaining functional for daily activities. A well-made cloak was essentially wearable architecture that could be configured for different weather conditions and activities, transforming from windbreaker to sleeping bag to rain shelter as circumstances required. The construction of cloaks required understanding aerodynamics and weather protection that would impress modern outdoor gear designers. The shape, weight, and closure systems of cloaks had to allow for effective protection while maintaining mobility and functionality. Too heavy and the cloak would impede movement. Too light and it wouldn't provide adequate protection. The proportions had to be precisely calculated to provide maximum coverage, while avoiding the drag and entanglement that could make cloaks hazardous in windy conditions or combat situations. The fastening systems for cloaks represented sophisticated engineering solutions to the challenge of keeping protective clothing securely in place, while allowing for quick adjustment or removal when circumstances changed. Brooches and pins weren't just decorative accessories. They were functional hardware that had to hold substantial weight and stress, while remaining easy to operate even when wearing gloves, or in conditions where manual dexterity was compromised by cold. The fur components of Viking winter clothing represented the pinnacle of both luxury and functionality, providing insulation that no other available material could match, while displaying wealth and hunting prowess in ways that reinforced social hierarchies and cultural values. Fur wasn't just added to clothing for warmth, it was integrated into garments through sophisticated techniques that maximized thermal efficiency, while creating clothing that was both practical and impressive. The acquisition of fur required hunting skills, trading relationships, or economic resources that made fur clothing a clear indicator of social status and personal capabilities. Different furs had different properties and values. Bear fur was prized for its exceptional warmth and the obvious courage required to acquire it. Wolf fur was valued for its durability and symbolic associations with warrior culture. And fox fur was appreciated for its beauty and relative abundance. The selection and use of different furs in Viking clothing wasn't random. It reflected careful choices about function, status, and cultural meaning. The preparation of furs for clothing required specialized knowledge about tanning, softening, and preserving that transformed raw pelts into materials suitable for incorporation into garments. Poor preparation could result in furs that were stiff, smelly, prone to rotting, or attractive to vermin, making proper fur processing essential for creating clothing that would remain functional and pleasant to wear over extended periods. Viking fur workers developed techniques that produce soft, durable, odor-free materials that could be sewn and maintained like other textile materials. The integration of fur into Viking clothing followed principles that maximized thermal efficiency while maintaining the flexibility and functionality needed for active lifestyles. Fur was often used in specific locations where its properties were most beneficial. Fur-lined hoods provided exceptional protection for the head and neck. Fur collars created thermal barriers around the critical throat area, and fur trim around openings helped seal gaps where heat could escape. The strategic placement of fur in Viking garments demonstrated understanding of heat loss patterns and thermal engineering that was remarkably sophisticated. The social implications of fur clothing in Viking society extended far beyond simple warmth and comfort, creating visual displays of wealth, status, and cultural values that could be read instantly by anyone familiar with the social codes of medieval Scandinavia. The quality, quantity, and type of fur in someone's clothing provided information about their hunting skills, trading connections, economic resources, and social position that function like a resume, worn on the outside of their survival gear. The maintenance and care of fur clothing required ongoing attention and specialized knowledge that made fur garments significant investments of time and resources beyond their initial acquisition and preparation. Furs had to be cleaned, aired, protected from insects, and stored properly to maintain their insulating properties and prevent deterioration. The complexity of fur maintenance meant that fur clothing was often reserved for special occasions or particularly harsh weather, with everyday clothing made from more easily maintained materials. The role of women in Viking textile production represented one of the most crucial and sophisticated aspects of medieval survival technology, involving skills that combined artistic creativity with engineering precision and chemical knowledge that would challenge modern textile professionals. Women controlled virtually every aspect of clothing production, from the initial processing of raw materials through the final construction of finished garments, making them the architects and engineers of the survival systems that kept their communities alive through winter. The economic importance of textile production in Viking society gave women significant influence and status, despite the patriarchal structure of medieval Scandinavian culture. A woman who could produce exceptional textiles was valuable beyond measure, since the quality of her work directly affected the survival and social standing of her entire household. The skills required for textile production were complex enough that mastery took years or decades to achieve. creating expertise that was recognized and respected throughout Viking society. The social aspects of textile production created networks of knowledge sharing and cooperation among women that transcended individual household boundaries and reinforced community bonds. Textile work was often done in groups where experienced women taught younger ones while sharing information about techniques, materials, and innovations. These textile gatherings served as informal schools, social networks, and support systems that were essential for maintaining and advancing the technological knowledge that underwrote Viking survival. The tools used in Viking textile production were precision instruments that required skill to make and expertise to use effectively. Spindles, looms, needles, and other textile tools were often beautifully crafted objects that reflected both their functional importance and their role as symbols of women's expertise and status. The quality and sophistication of textile tools could indicate the skill level of their owner and the importance of textile production in the household economy. The relationship between textile production and social status created hierarchies among women that reflected both skill levels and economic resources. Women who produced the finest textiles enjoyed status and influence that extended beyond their immediate households, while women who controlled access to rare materials or specialized techniques could become influential figures in their communities. The textile economy created opportunities for women to achieve status and influence through expertise, rather than just birth or marriage. The seasonal cycles of textile production required coordination with other household and community activities to ensure that the massive amounts of work required for clothing production could be completed when conditions and resources were optimal. Sheep shearing, flax harvesting, dyeing, and other time-sensitive activities had to be scheduled carefully to maximize efficiency while coordinating with agricultural work, food preservation, and other competing demands for labor and attention. The storage and organization of textile materials and finished clothing required sophisticated inventory management that ensured adequate supplies for current needs while building reserves for future requirements. Households had to maintain stocks of raw materials, partially processed materials, and finished goods that represented substantial investments of time, labor, and resources. The management of textile inventories required planning skills that would challenge modern supply chain managers. The repair and maintenance of Viking clothing was an ongoing necessity that required skills and resources that were almost as demanding as creating new garments. In a society where clothing represented enormous investments of time and materials, the ability to extend the life of garments through skillful repair was essential for household economy and survival. Women developed techniques for repairing, altering, and updating clothing that maximized the utility of expensive textile investments. The inheritance and transfer of clothing within Viking families created traditions and practices that reflected both economic reality and cultural values. High-quality clothing was often passed down through generations, with garments being altered, updated, and maintained to serve multiple family members over extended periods. The inheritance of clothing wasn't just about economics. It was about transferring cultural knowledge, family identity, and social connections along with the physical garments. The relationship between clothing and identity in Viking culture created complex connections between personal appearance, social status, and cultural belonging that influenced how people dressed and how clothing was perceived by others. Clothing choices weren't just about comfort and protection. They were statements about identity, allegiance, and values that could communicate complex information about the wearer to anyone familiar with the cultural codes embedded in textile choices. The practical challenges of maintaining clothing in harsh winter conditions required techniques and strategies that balance preservation with functionality, ensuring that expensive garments remain serviceable throughout the cold months, while providing adequate protection for survival. Wet clothing had to be dried carefully to prevent damage. Dirty clothing had to be cleaned without access to modern washing facilities, and damaged clothing had to be repaired quickly to prevent small problems from becoming major failures of the survival system. The psychological aspects of clothing in Viking culture provided comfort and confidence that were just as important as physical warmth and protection. Well-made, attractive clothing could boost morale and self-confidence in ways that improved performance and survival chances, while inadequate or unattractive clothing could undermine confidence and social standing in ways that affected psychological well-being and community relationships. The innovation and adaptation in Viking clothing design reflected ongoing efforts to improve functionality, comfort, and protection through experimentation with new materials, techniques, and designs. Viking textile workers were constantly refining their methods and exploring new possibilities for improving their products, creating a tradition of innovation that gradually advanced the state-of-the-art in survival clothing technology. The trade and exchange of clothing and textile materials created networks of economic and cultural interaction that connected Viking communities with distant sources of materials and ideas. Luxury textiles and exotic materials obtained through trade allowed for clothing innovations that wouldn't have been possible using only local resources, while the export of Viking textile products provided economic benefits that supported community prosperity and growth. The symbolic and ceremonial aspects of Viking clothing created meanings and associations that extended far beyond practical utility, transforming survival gear into cultural artifacts that carried religious, social, and political significance. Special clothing for ceremonies, festivals, and important occasions served functions that were more about cultural expression and social bonding than about protection from the elements, though the same technical expertise that created survival clothing was applied to creating garments for ceremonial purposes. The legacy of Viking clothing technology and textile expertise influenced clothing traditions throughout Northern Europe and established principles of functional design that remain relevant for modern survival and outdoor clothing. The Viking understanding that clothing was a complex system rather than just individual garments continues to influence how outdoor enthusiasts and survival experts approach the challenge of staying warm and protected in harsh conditions. The environmental adaptation shown in Viking clothing design demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how different materials and design choices performed in specific climatic conditions. Knowledge that was gained through generations of experimentation and refinement. Vikings developed clothing systems that were specifically optimized for their particular environmental challenges, creating solutions that worked exceptionally well in their context, while establishing principles that could be adapted for other harsh environments. The community cooperation required for Viking textile production created social bonds and mutual dependencies that reinforced community cohesion, while ensuring that essential survival technologies were maintained and advanced. The complex coordination required for producing adequate clothing for entire communities created relationships and obligations that strengthened social structures while ensuring that no one faced winter without adequate protection. As spring arrived and the desperate clothing conservation of winter gave way to the relative luxury of warmer weather, Vikings could assess the performance of their clothing systems and begin planning improvements for the following year. The lessons learned during each winter's test of survival clothing informed decisions about materials, construction, and design that gradually improved the effectiveness of Viking clothing technology over time. The Viking mastery of winter clothing represents one of humanity's most sophisticated responses to the challenge of maintaining warmth, comfort, and social identity in extreme cold, demonstrating that survival technology can be both highly functional and aesthetically pleasing. Their clothing systems prove that technical excellence and cultural expression are not mutually exclusive, and that the most effective survival gear often emerges from the intersection of practical necessity and artistic ambition. In the end, Viking clothing was more than just protection against the cold. It was wearable technology that enabled an entire civilization to thrive in conditions that might otherwise have been uninhabitable, wrapped in style that would make modern fashion designers weep with envy, and outdoor gear companies reconsider everything they thought they knew about functional design. If you think making tough decisions about your budget is stressful, imagine having to calculate whether your elderly grandmother represented more of a drain on winter food supplies than she was worth in accumulated wisdom and knitting skills. For Vikings, winter wasn't just an inconvenience or a season to endure with hot chocolate and central heating. It was an annual accounting exercise where communities had to balance resources against mouths to feed. And sometimes the math came out in ways that would make modern ethicists reach for stronger beverages and reconsider their career choices. When the elaborate survival strategies of longhouse engineering, food preservation, and textile production failed, as they inevitably did with depressing regularity, Vikings faced decisions that stripped away all pretense of civilization and revealed the brutal arithmetic of survival in its rawest, most unforgiving form. The failure of Viking winter survival wasn't usually dramatic or sudden, like a catastrophic fire or building collapse that announced itself with obvious destruction and immediate crisis. Instead, it was typically a slow-motion disaster that crept through communities like a patient predator, beginning with small shortages and minor inconveniences that gradually escalated into desperate shortages and impossible choices. It was death by 1,000 tiny miscalculations, each one seemingly manageable until they accumulated into a crisis that no amount of Norse stubbornness or ingenuity could solve. The mathematics of survival became brutally clear when food stores that were supposed to last 6 months began dwindling after 4, when carefully preserved meat started showing signs of spoilage just as the coldest weather arrived, or when unexpected guests or extended bad weather pushed consumption beyond the limits of even the most generous preparations. Vikings lived on the edge of a knife, where the margin between adequacy and disaster was often measured in pounds of grain or days of fuel. And crossing that line meant entering territory where survival required decisions that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Starvation winters arrived with the regularity of tax bills and the predictability of family arguments, turning carefully planned communities into laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance and the flexibility of moral codes under extreme stress. These weren't just bad years or challenging seasons. They were systematic failures of the survival systems that Vikings had spent centuries perfecting, proof that even the most sophisticated preparation and the most determined effort couldn't completely eliminate the possibility that winter would win the annual siege and claim its tribute in human lives. The earliest signs of approaching starvation were often subtle enough that communities could maintain hope and denial well into the crisis. Like passengers on a sinking ship who spend valuable time rearranging deck chairs instead of acknowledging that the water is rising. Food portions gradually decreased from generous to adequate to meager, but the changes happened slowly enough that people could adapt psychologically while maintaining the fiction that things weren't really that serious. The transition from tightening our belts to wondering who will have to eat first happened so gradually that communities often didn't recognize they'd crossed the line until they were already deep into crisis territory. The hierarchy of consumption during starvation periods revealed the brutal social mathematics that governed Viking communities. When resources became insufficient to maintain everyone at survival levels, the strong ate first, the weak ate last, and those who contributed least to community survival found themselves receiving portions that were less suggestions for living than polite preparations for dying. It was resource allocation, based on brutal utility calculations, that would make modern human resources departments flee to careers in more ethical fields, like loan sharking or political consulting. Children and pregnant women typically retained priority access to food even during shortages, but the definition of child could become surprisingly flexible when survival was at stake. A 14-year-old who could work like an adult might eat like an adult, while a 12-year-old who couldn't contribute meaningfully to community survival might find their food allocation adjusted downward with the kind of mathematical precision that modern actuaries would recognize as professionally competent but morally devastating. The elderly faced the most precarious position during starvation periods. Caught between their accumulated wisdom and cultural value on one hand, and their reduced ability to contribute to community survival on the other. Grandparents who had survived dozens of winters and accumulated lifetimes of essential knowledge could find themselves weighing their own survival against the mathematical reality that the food they consumed might keep a working-age adult alive long enough to ensure community survival. It was a calculation that pitted individual self-preservation against community welfare in ways that revealed both the nobility and the horror of human nature under extreme stress. The practice of exposure, abandoning the weak, elderly, or sick to die in the cold, represented the most brutal expression of survival mathematics that Vikings employed when resources became insufficient to sustain entire communities. It wasn't murder in the conventional sense, since no one actively killed the victims, but it was a form of calculated abandonment that achieved the same result with slightly less direct moral responsibility. The victims were simply left outside in conditions that would kill them quickly. allowing the community to reduce consumption while maintaining the fiction that they weren't actively committing homicide. The selection process for exposure revealed the harsh logic that governed these decisions, with communities forced to evaluate their members according to criteria that would make modern human resources evaluations seem warm and fuzzy by comparison. Contribution to community survival was the primary factor, but it was balanced against resource consumption, likelihood of recovery from illness or injury, and simple mathematical projections about whether someone was more likely to help or hinder overall community survival through the remaining winter months. The elderly who volunteered for exposure often did so as acts of community service rather than personal despair, recognizing that their deaths might allow younger community members to survive and ensure the continuation of family lines and cultural traditions. These voluntary sacrifices were honored as heroic acts of selflessness rather than tragic necessities, allowing communities to maintain some sense of dignity and purpose, even in the most desperate circumstances. The psychological framework that transformed abandonment into heroism was perhaps the most sophisticated survival strategy Vikings developed, since it allowed communities to make brutal decisions while preserving the moral framework needed to function as civilized societies. The rituals and ceremonies surrounding exposure practices attempted to provide dignity and meaning to what was essentially organized abandonment, creating cultural frameworks that transform necessity into honor and desperation into heroism. The victims were often given ceremonial send-offs that honored their contributions to the community while preparing them spiritually for death, creating meanings that made the unbearable decisions slightly more bearable for everyone involved. The psychological impact on survivors of exposure decisions created trauma that could last for generations, as community members struggled with guilt, grief, and the knowledge that they had participated in the abandonment of people they loved. The communities that survived starvation winters often carried the scars of these decisions for decades, creating cultural memories that influenced future survival strategies and social relationships in ways that emphasize the prevention of circumstances that might require such choices again. The children who survived exposure decisions often grew up with intimate knowledge of exactly how close they had come to being abandoned themselves, creating psychological frameworks that combined gratitude for survival with terror about the fragility of community protection. These survivors often became the most determined advocates for extensive survival preparations and resource accumulation, driven by personal experience of how quickly civilized behavior could break down under stress. Winter raiding represented another response to survival crisis that channeled desperation into violence, transforming communities that couldn't feed themselves into military expeditions, seeking to solve resource shortages through organized theft and conquest. When internal resources proved insufficient, Vikings looked outward for solutions, launching raids that were motivated less by traditional desires for glory and wealth than by simple desperation to acquire the food and supplies needed to prevent community starvation. These desperation raids were different from the more famous Viking expeditions that sought wealth, adventure, and expansion opportunities. Starvation raids were grim affairs, motivated by immediate survival needs rather than long-term strategic goals. Launched by communities that had already pushed their internal resources beyond sustainable limits and needed external supplies to avoid mass death. The raiders weren't seeking glory or adventure. They were shopping for groceries with swords and axes instead of currency. The targeting for desperation raids focused on communities that possessed the resources needed for immediate survival rather than the wealth that might support long-term prosperity. Granaries, livestock, preserved foods and fuel supplies became primary objectives, while traditional raid targets like precious metals and luxury goods were secondary considerations at best. The raiders were essentially conducting armed supply runs, seeking the basic necessities of survival, rather than the treasures that typically motivated Viking expeditions. The organization of desperation raids required different planning and resource allocation than traditional raiding expeditions, since the communities launching these raids were already operating at the margins of survival and couldn't afford to invest heavily in expedition equipment and supplies. The raids had to be planned with minimal resource investment while maximizing the potential return in essential supplies, creating logistical challenges that tested the survival skills of communities that were already struggling with basic resource management. The timing of desperation raids was often driven by the mathematics of starvation rather than optimal military or weather conditions, forcing Vikings to launch expeditions during periods when traditional raiding would be considered impossible or inadvisable. Winter raids through hostile weather and difficult terrain became necessity rather than choice, creating military challenges that pushed Viking seamanship and warfare skills to their absolute limits. The moral framework that justified desperation raiding required psychological adjustments that allowed starving communities to rationalize violence against other communities that might be facing similar survival challenges. The raiders had to develop mental frameworks that portrayed their victims as legitimate targets rather than fellow sufferers, creating us versus them mentalities that made violence psychologically tolerable, even when it was directed against communities that were themselves struggling with survival. The success rates of desperation raids were often lower than traditional Viking expeditions, since starving raiders were operating at reduced physical capacity while targeting communities that were likely to be well defended and heavily fortified against exactly the kind of attacks that desperate neighbors might launch. The combination of weakened raiders and alert defenders created military situations that were far more challenging than the opportunistic raids against unprepared targets that characterized successful Viking operations. The consequences of failed desperation raids could be catastrophic for the communities that launched them, since the failure meant both the loss of the resources invested in the expedition and the elimination of some of the community's most capable members at the time when they were most needed for survival. Failed raids could accelerate community collapse by removing the people and resources that might have allowed survival through more conservative strategies, turning desperate gambles into community death sentences. The psychological impact of desperation, raiding on both raiders and victims, created trauma and moral damage that extended far beyond the immediate military consequences of the expeditions. Raiders had to live with the knowledge that they had stolen food from other starving communities, while survivors of raids faced the terror of knowing that their neighbors might become enemies whenever survival resources became scarce. The social fabric that held communities together could be permanently damaged by the knowledge that cooperation might give way to violence whenever circumstances became sufficiently desperate. The breakdown of traditional social structures during survival crises revealed how quickly the cultural frameworks that governed normal Viking society could dissolve under extreme stress, transforming communities that functioned effectively under normal circumstances into collections of desperate individuals competing for limited resources. The social bonds that held communities together during normal times proved surprisingly fragile when survival was at stake, creating situations where former friends and neighbors became competitors and potential threats. The leadership challenges during survival crises tested the authority and decision-making abilities of traditional Viking leaders in ways that normal governance rarely required, forcing jarls and community leaders to make decisions that could preserve communities while destroying the moral frameworks that made those communities worth preserving. Leaders had to balance immediate survival needs against long-term community welfare, often choosing between maintaining social order and ensuring that enough people survived to rebuild when conditions improved. The conflict between individual survival instincts and community welfare created ethical dilemmas that tested the fundamental values that defined Viking culture, forcing people to choose between personal survival and cultural identity in ways that revealed both the strength and the limitations of cultural conditioning. The communities that survived these tests often emerged with different value systems and social structures, permanently changed by the decisions they had made during the crisis periods. The role of luck and external factors in survival outcomes meant that communities could make all the right decisions and still face extinction, while other communities might survive through circumstances that had little to do with their preparation or decision-making abilities. The random elements that influenced survival created psychological stress and moral confusion that challenged traditional beliefs about the relationship between virtue and reward, effort and outcome. The long-term psychological consequences of survival crises affected generations of Vikings who grew up with personal or family memories of starvation, exposure, and desperation raiding, creating cultural memories that influenced attitudes toward resource accumulation, community cooperation, and social obligations. The trauma of survival crises became embedded in Viking culture in ways that shaped their attitudes toward risk, preparation, and the obligations that communities owed to their members under extreme circumstances. The technological and social innovations that emerged from survival crises often represented attempts to prevent future occurrences of the conditions that had led to desperate decisions and community breakdown. Communities that survive starvation winters often develop more sophisticated food storage systems, more extensive trading networks, and more robust social support systems designed to provide alternatives to exposure and desperation raiding when resources became scarce. The cultural memory of survival crises influenced Viking attitudes toward expansion and colonization, creating motivations for seeking new territories and resources that went beyond simple desires for wealth and adventure. The knowledge that even well-prepared communities could face extinction during particularly harsh winters provided powerful incentives for seeking more secure resource bases and more diversified survival strategies that might reduce vulnerability to localized disasters. The religious and spiritual responses to survival crises reflected attempts to find meaning and purpose in experiences that challenged basic assumptions about justice, divine protection, and the relationship between moral behavior and survival outcomes. Vikings developed theological frameworks that could accommodate the reality that good people sometimes faced horrible choices, and that survival sometimes required actions that violated traditional moral codes. The stories and legends that grew up around survival crises served both as warnings about the dangers of inadequate preparation and as celebrations of the human capacity to endure and overcome extreme hardship. These cultural narratives help communities process the trauma of survival crises, while transmitting practical knowledge about survival strategies and social obligations that might be relevant in future emergencies. The comparison between Viking survival crises and modern emergency preparedness reveals both the sophistication of medieval survival strategies and the psychological challenges that any community faces when normal social structures become inadequate for dealing with extreme stress. The basic human challenges of allocating scarce resources, maintaining social cohesion, and preserving moral frameworks under pressure remain relevant regardless of technological advancement or cultural sophistication. The legacy of Viking survival crises extends beyond historical curiosity to provide insights into the fundamental challenges that any community faces when pushed beyond the limits of its survival systems. The decisions that Vikings made during their darkest winters reveal both the potential for human nobility under extreme stress and the brutal realities that can emerge when survival becomes uncertain and resources become insufficient to maintain normal social relationships. In the end, the deadly winters that claimed Viking communities, despite their sophisticated survival strategies, serve as reminders that even the most careful preparation and the most determined effort cannot completely eliminate the possibility of disaster, and that the difference between civilization and barbarism can sometimes be measured in pounds of grain or degrees of temperature. The Vikings who faced these challenges and the communities that survived them demonstrate both the remarkable resilience of human societies and the terrifying fragility of the social bonds that hold communities together when everything else fails. Their stories remind us that survival is never guaranteed, that preparation is never complete, and that the margin between life and death, between civilization and chaos, is often far narrower than we would prefer to believe. A lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in the frozen longhouses of medieval Scandinavia, where desperate people made desperate choices and somehow found ways to continue living, even when living required them to become people they never intended to be. If you think spending a long weekend with your extended family tests the limits of human patience and diplomatic skills, imagine being locked in a smoky wooden building with 50 of your closest relatives, neighbors, and livestock for 6 straight months, with no possibility of escape, no privacy, no personal space, and no option to step outside for a breath of fresh air without risking immediate death by freezing. Vikings didn't just survive winter through superior engineering, careful food preservation, and effective clothing systems. They survived it psychologically and socially, maintaining the complex web of relationships, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs that held their communities together when isolation and darkness threatened to drive them into the kind of cabin fever that could turn neighbors into enemies and families into collections of bitter strangers sharing space until spring. arrive to liberate them from each other. The psychological challenges of Viking winter survival were arguably more daunting than the physical ones, since humans could adapt to cold, hunger, and discomfort more easily than they could adapt to months of enforced proximity with people who might start to seem unbearably annoying sometime around the third week of November. The Longhouse wasn't just a survival shelter. It was a social pressure cooker that concentrated all the personality conflicts, interpersonal tensions, and minor irritations of community life into a confined space where escape was impossible and privacy was a luxury that existed only in the imagination. If modern people struggle with seasonal affective disorder during brief periods of reduced daylight, imagine dealing with polar nights that could last for months, where the sun disappeared entirely and darkness became so complete and persistent that people began to forget what daylight looked like. Vikings lived through winters where the boundary between day and night became meaningless, where time was measured not by the sun's movement, but by the rhythm of fires that provided the only light in a world that had temporarily forgotten that illumination was supposed to come from the sky. The darkness wasn't just an inconvenience or a source of depression. It was a fundamental challenge to human psychology that threatened to undermine the mental frameworks that people used to organize their understanding of time, space, and reality itself. When darkness became permanent and the familiar rhythms of day and night disappeared, Vikings had to develop alternative ways of structuring time and maintaining psychological stability that went far beyond simply lighting more candles or burning more wood for illumination. The social dynamics of longhouse life during the depths of winter required diplomatic skills that would challenge modern United Nations mediators, since Vikings had to manage the complex interactions of multiple families, social classes, age groups, and personality types in conditions that would strain the patience of trained psychologists working in controlled environments. Every snore, every cough, every annoying habit or personality quirk became magnified by constant proximity until minor irritations could escalate into major conflicts that threatened community survival. The traditional Norse solution to these psychological challenges relied heavily on structured cultural activities that provided outlets for tension, entertainment that distracted from discomfort, and social rituals that reinforced community bonds while giving people meaningful ways to spend the endless dark hours. Vikings didn't just endure winter. They actively engaged with it through cultural practices that transformed survival time into opportunities for education, entertainment, and spiritual growth that strengthened communities while preserving the cultural knowledge that defined their identity. Storytelling became the cornerstone of Viking winter survival psychology, serving as entertainment, education, cultural preservation, and psychological therapy, all rolled into one sophisticated social institution that could occupy hours of time while serving multiple essential functions for community welfare. The art of storytelling wasn't just casual entertainment like modern television or social media. It was a highly developed cultural technology that required specialized skills and served crucial functions for community survival and cultural continuity. The role of the skald, or professional storyteller, elevated narrative art to the level of essential community infrastructure, creating positions of honor and responsibility for individuals whose skills in memory, creativity, and performance could literally determine whether communities survived winter with their sanity and social cohesion intact. Skalds weren't just entertainers, they were memory banks, cultural teachers, conflict mediators, and psychological counselors whose abilities to weave words into compelling narratives could mean the difference between a community that emerged from winter stronger and more unified, and one that dissolved into bitter fragments when spring finally arrived. The selection and training of skalds required identifying individuals with exceptional memory, creative ability, and social sensitivity, who could master the complex demands of maintaining extensive repertoires of stories while adapting their performances to the specific needs and mood of their audiences. A skilled skald had to memorize thousands of lines of poetry, hundreds of stories, and complex genealogies and historical accounts that preserved cultural knowledge while entertaining audiences who might be hearing the same stories for the dozenth time in a single winter. The structure of Viking storytelling followed sophisticated patterns that served psychological and social functions beyond mere entertainment, creating narrative frameworks that reinforced cultural values while providing emotional outlets for the stress and tension of winter isolation. The stories weren't just random entertainment, they were carefully constructed cultural tools that addressed specific psychological needs and social challenges that arose during extended periods of forced proximity and environmental stress. The epic sagas that form the backbone of Viking storytelling served as both entertainment and education, transmitting cultural values, historical knowledge, and practical wisdom through narratives that made abstract concepts concrete and memorable. The heroes of these sagas provided role models for behavior, while their adventures offered vicarious excitement that could temporarily transport listeners from the smoky confines of the Longhouse to imaginary worlds where gods walked among mortals and ordinary people could achieve extraordinary deeds through courage, cunning, and determination. The religious and mythological stories that formed another crucial component of Viking storytelling served spiritual and psychological functions that helped people make sense of their place in a universe that could seem randomly hostile during the darkest months of winter. The tales of gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya provided frameworks for understanding divine intervention in human affairs, while offering reassurance that powerful forces were engaged in cosmic struggles that gave meaning to human suffering and endurance. The genealogical recitations that preserved family histories and community connections served social functions that reinforced identity and belonging while providing people with sense of continuity that extended beyond the immediate challenges of winter survival. Knowing your place in the long chain of ancestors and descendants provided psychological anchoring that could help people endure temporary hardships while maintaining hope for future generations who would benefit from current sacrifices and struggles. The interactive aspects of Viking storytelling created opportunities for community participation that broke down the passive entertainment model and transformed narrative performance into collaborative cultural creation that involved everyone in the Longhouse. Audiences weren't just listeners, they were participants who could contribute details, suggest modifications, or even take turns adding to stories in ways that made storytelling a community activity rather than a one-person performance. The adaptation of stories to specific circumstances and audiences required skalds to demonstrate social sensitivity and creative flexibility that allowed them to modify traditional narratives to address current community issues, conflicts, or concerns. A skilled storyteller could use familiar stories to provide subtle commentary on community problems, offer guidance for difficult decisions, or provide emotional catharsis for tensions that couldn't be addressed directly without causing social disruption. The timing and pacing of storytelling sessions required understanding group psychology and energy management that allowed skalds to gauge audience mood and attention while structuring narrative sessions to provide maximum psychological benefit. Different types of stories serve different functions at different times. Exciting adventure tales might be used to boost morale during particularly difficult periods, while quieter, more contemplative narratives might be employed when the community needed calming influences or philosophical reflection. The preservation of cultural memory through storytelling created living libraries that maintained essential cultural knowledge without requiring written records that most Vikings couldn't read and that wouldn't survive the harsh conditions of medieval Scandinavian life. The stories served as repositories for historical knowledge, practical wisdom, religious beliefs, and cultural values that needed to be transmitted from generation to generation in societies that relied primarily on oral tradition for cultural continuity. The competitive aspects of storytelling created structured outlets for individual expression and achievement that allowed people to gain recognition and status through cultural contributions, rather than just physical prowess or economic success. Storytelling contests and performances provided opportunities for friendly competition that channeled competitive energies into constructive activities while identifying and developing cultural talents that benefited entire communities. Religious observances and festivals provided another crucial component of Viking winter survival psychology, creating structured celebrations and spiritual activities that mark the passage of time while reinforcing community bonds and cultural identity during the darkest months of the year. These weren't just casual celebrations or optional spiritual activities. They were essential psychological infrastructure that provided meaning, hope, and social cohesion when environmental conditions threatened to undermine all three. The winter solstice celebrations mark the most important religious observance of the Viking winter, commemorating the turning point when the sun began its return journey, and the days would gradually begin to lengthen again. The Yule Festival wasn't just a party, it was a community affirmation of faith in renewal and rebirth that provided psychological anchoring during the period when darkness seemed most complete and permanent. The celebration served as a promise that spring would return, that survival was possible, and that the current hardships were temporary rather than permanent conditions. The religious rituals associated with Yule required community cooperation and resource investment that demonstrated commitment to cultural values, even when survival resources were scarce and every expenditure had to be carefully justified. The willingness to invest precious food, fuel, and materials in festival celebrations during the most difficult period of winter showed that Vikings understood the psychological and social value of maintaining cultural practices, even when physical survival demanded maximum conservation of resources. The role of sacrifice and offering in Viking winter religious practices created opportunities for community members to demonstrate devotion while seeking divine intervention in survival challenges that were beyond human control. The gods weren't just distant mythological figures, they were active participants in daily survival struggles, who could be approached through proper rituals and offerings for assistance with weather, food preservation, health, and protection from the various disasters that could claim individual lives or entire communities. The seasonal festivals that marked different phases of winter provided psychological milestones that broke the long months of darkness into manageable segments, while creating anticipated events that gave people something to look forward to during the most difficult periods. These festivals weren't just arbitrary celebrations, they were carefully timed psychological interventions that provided hope, entertainment, and social bonding at precisely the moments when communities most needed these benefits. The integration of religious observance with practical survival activities created spiritual frameworks that gave sacred meaning to the mundane tasks of winter survival, while reinforcing the idea that survival itself was a form of religious devotion. The maintenance of fires, the preparation of food, and the care of community members became acts of worship that connected daily survival activities with larger spiritual purposes and divine relationships. The role of divination and prophecy in Viking winter. Religious practices provided psychological tools for dealing with uncertainty and anxiety about future survival prospects, while creating frameworks for making decisions about resource allocation and survival strategies. The consultation of oracles, runes, and other divinatory systems offered ways of seeking divine guidance for practical decisions while providing reassurance that survival outcomes weren't entirely dependent on human planning and effort. The communal aspects of religious observance created shared experiences that reinforced social bonds while providing psychological benefits that came from participating in larger purposes beyond individual survival concerns. Religious activities that involved entire communities created feelings of unity and shared purpose that could help people transcend the petty conflicts and irritations that inevitably arose during extended periods of forced proximity. The preservation of religious knowledge and practice through winter observances ensured that cultural and spiritual traditions would be maintained and transmitted, even during periods when survival demands might otherwise overwhelm cultural activities. The continuation of religious practices during winter demonstrated community commitment to maintaining cultural identity even under extreme stress, while ensuring that younger generations would learn essential spiritual knowledge and practices. Communal work projects provided another essential component of Viking winter survival psychology, creating productive activities that occupied time and energy, while contributing to community welfare and individual sense of purpose. These weren't just make-work activities designed to keep idle hands busy. They were essential survival activities that required coordination and cooperation, while providing psychological benefits that came from meaningful productive activity and social cooperation. The coordination of wintercraft production created opportunities for community members to contribute specialized skills, while learning from others in activities that combined practical necessity with social interaction and skill development. The Longhouse became a workshop where people could engage in metalworking, textile production, woodworking, and other crafts that produced goods needed for survival while providing engaging activities that made productive use of time that might otherwise be spent dwelling on discomfort and anxiety. The teaching and learning activities that accompanied communal work projects created educational opportunities that ensured essential skills would be transmitted to younger generations, while providing meaningful activities for older community members whose survival contributions might otherwise be limited by age and physical capacity. The winter workshops became informal schools where children and young adults could learn essential life skills while contributing to community welfare according to their abilities and developmental stage. The problem-solving aspects of wintercraft projects created intellectual challenges that provided mental stimulation and creative outlets that could help prevent the psychological deterioration that might result from months of mental inactivity and environmental stress. The challenges of creating useful objects with limited materials and primitive tools required creativity and ingenuity that engage people's minds while producing tangible benefits for community survival. The social aspects of communal work projects created opportunities for cooperation and relationship building that strengthened community bonds while providing structured activities that channeled social energies in constructive directions. Working together on shared projects created natural opportunities for conversation, cooperation, and mutual assistance that might not arise in other contexts, while reinforcing the interdependence that was essential for community survival. The seasonal timing of different work projects created natural rhythms and progression that provided psychological structure for the winter months, while ensuring that essential tasks were completed when conditions and resources were optimal. Different crafts and projects were appropriate for different phases of winter, creating variety and progression that prevented the monotony that might otherwise undermine motivation and morale. The quality and innovation aspects of wintercraft production created opportunities for individual achievement and recognition that allowed people to gain status and satisfaction through excellence in productive activities rather than just survival endurance. The creation of exceptional tools, textiles, or other goods provided ways for people to express creativity and skill while contributing to community welfare in ways that could be recognized and appreciated by others. The inventory and resource management aspects of communal work projects required planning and organization skills that engage people's minds while serving practical survival functions that benefited entire communities. The coordination of materials, tools, and skills needed for wintercraft production created complex logistical challenges that required cooperation and problem-solving abilities, while producing tangible benefits that justified the time and energy invested. The psychological strategies that Vikings developed for maintaining mental health and social cohesion during winter isolation were perhaps their most sophisticated survival technology, creating cultural tools that allowed communities to preserve sanity and relationships during conditions that would challenge the coping abilities of modern people with access to professional psychological services and pharmaceutical interventions. These strategies represented accumulated wisdom about human psychology that was gained through generations of experience with extreme isolation and environmental stress. The conflict resolution systems that Vikings developed for managing interpersonal disputes during winter confinement had to balance the need for justice and social order with the practical reality that exile or other traditional punishments might be equivalent to death sentences during winter months. The longhouse required its own legal and social systems that could address conflicts while maintaining community cohesion and ensuring that disputes didn't escalate into violence that could threaten everyone's survival. The privacy and personal space management strategies that allowed Vikings to maintain individual identity and psychological health while living in crowded conditions required sophisticated understanding of human psychological needs and creative solutions to the challenge of creating personal boundaries in shared spaces. People developed techniques for creating psychological privacy, even when physical privacy was impossible, while respecting others' needs for personal space and individual identity. The leadership and authority systems that governed winter communities had to balance traditional social hierarchies with the practical demands of survival cooperation, while maintaining social order without creating oppressive conditions that might undermine morale and community cohesion. Winter leadership required different skills than summer leadership, emphasizing psychological management and social coordination rather than military prowess or economic success. The entertainment and recreation activities that supplemented storytelling and religious observances provided additional outlets for energy and creativity, while creating variety that prevented monotony from undermining psychological health. Games, music, dancing, and other recreational activities served essential psychological functions, while providing structured social interactions that could help maintain community bonds and individual mental health. The personal hygiene and health maintenance practices that were possible during winter confinement required balancing cleanliness and health needs with practical limitations imposed by limited water, fuel, and space, while maintaining community standards that prevented health problems from spreading through crowded living conditions. The psychological benefits of maintaining personal dignity and cleanliness had to be balanced against survival resource conservation in ways that required careful judgment and community cooperation. The sleep and rest management strategies that allowed people to get adequate rest in crowded, noisy conditions required developing tolerance for disturbance, while creating informal systems that minimized conflicts over sleeping arrangements and rest periods. The psychological health benefits of adequate sleep had to be balanced against the practical limitations of shared sleeping spaces and the need to maintain fires and security throughout the night. The emotional and psychological support systems that helped people cope with stress, grief, loss, and anxiety during winter isolation created informal networks of mutual assistance that provided psychological benefits that were just as important as material support for survival. People developed ways of providing comfort, encouragement, and emotional assistance to community members who were struggling with the psychological challenges of winter survival. The memory and mental exercise activities that helped people maintain cognitive function during months of limited mental stimulation created informal educational systems that preserved intellectual capacity while providing engaging activities that could occupy time and energy in constructive ways. Memory games, riddle contests, and other intellectual challenges provided mental stimulation while serving social functions that reinforced community bonds. The hope and future planning activities that helped people maintain psychological focus on survival goals and post-winter objectives created frameworks for enduring temporary hardship while maintaining motivation and purpose that extended beyond immediate survival concerns. The ability to maintain hope and plan for the future was perhaps the most important psychological survival skill that Vikings developed for winter survival. The cultural preservation and transmission activities that ensured essential knowledge and traditions would survive winter challenges created purposes that extended beyond individual survival to encompass community and cultural continuity that gave meaning to current hardships and sacrifices. The knowledge that current survival efforts were serving larger purposes than just individual preservation provided psychological anchoring that could help people endure temporary suffering while maintaining cultural identity and values. The seasonal transition management strategies that helped communities cope with the psychological challenges of moving from summer abundance and freedom to winter scarcity and confinement created gradual adaptation processes that eased the psychological shock of dramatic lifestyle changes. The ability to manage seasonal transitions effectively could determine whether communities entered winter with positive attitudes and strong social bonds, or began the survival period already struggling with psychological and social problems. The group psychology and crowd management techniques that prevented individual psychological problems from spreading through communities and creating mass psychological crises required understanding how mental health problems could affect group dynamics, while developing intervention strategies that could provide help for individuals without undermining overall community stability. The confined conditions of winter survival meant that individual psychological problems could quickly become community problems that threatened everyone's survival. The legacy of Viking winter survival psychology extends far beyond historical curiosity to provide insights into fundamental human psychological needs and the cultural tools that communities can develop to maintain mental health and social cohesion under extreme stress. Their strategies for maintaining sanity, relationships, and cultural identity during extended periods of isolation and hardship remain relevant for modern communities facing psychological challenges that require collective responses and mutual support. As spring finally arrived and the longhouse doors could be thrown open to welcome fresh air, sunlight, and the freedom to escape from months of enforced proximity, the communities that emerged were inevitably changed by their shared experience of survival. The relationships that had been tested by winter confinement, the cultural traditions that had been preserved through months of darkness, and the psychological strategies that had enabled survival, all became part of the accumulated wisdom that would guide future winter preparations and survival strategies. The Viking mastery of winter survival psychology represents one of humanity's most sophisticated responses to the challenge of maintaining sanity and social cohesion under extreme environmental stress, demonstrating that survival is not just about physical endurance, but also about preserving the cultural and psychological frameworks that make survival meaningful and worthwhile. Their techniques for maintaining community bonds, cultural identity, and individual mental health during months of darkness and isolation prove that human resilience extends far beyond mere physical survival to encompass the preservation of everything that makes communities worth preserving and individuals worth saving. In the end, the Vikings who survived winter didn't just outlast the cold and darkness. They emerged with their humanity intact, their communities strengthened, and their culture enriched by the experience of facing the ultimate test of social cooperation and psychological endurance. A testament to the remarkable capacity of human communities to not just survive, but thrive in conditions that would challenge every assumption about the limits of human adaptability and the power of cultural innovation to transform survival from mere existence into meaningful life.